Hello, night listener, and welcome to Little Nightmare. I'm Emma, and tonight I'll be keeping you company to help you fall asleep. But before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. Story 1. First thing Herbert felt was the cold, damp earth beneath his palms. A gritty paste of black soil and decaying leaves that seeped through the fibers of his trousers and chilled his skin. It was a thick, loamy cold, the kind that promised the long death of winter, and it carried the scent of rot and wet stone. He pushed himself up, his breath pluming in the air, and looked around. The woods behind his house were a cathedral of skeletal trees, their branches like black nerve endings against a bruised twilight sky. It was October 27th. The air tasted of wood smoke and distant frost. He had been sleepwalking again, a habit that returned to him every autumn with the migratory certainty of geese. But this was farther than he had ever gone before. His property bordered the vast, state-owned land that had once been the site of the Greenwood Biomedical Research Facility, a place that had closed under a cloud of scandal and vague official statements a decade prior. The chain-link fence was a joke, rusted and trampled down by deer and time. As he stood, brushing the cold mud from his hands, his eye caught a flicker of movement deep within the thicket, a shudder in the shadows that was too deliberate for an animal. A primal wire of alarm tightened in his chest. He told himself it was a deer, a trick of the deepening dusk, but the feeling persisted, a cold stone in his gut. He turned and walked back toward the warm, solitary lights of his house, the orange glow of the jack-o'-lantern on his porch steps seeming, for a moment, less like a welcome and more like a watchful, warding eye. The next day, the feeling clung to him. The entire town of Hemlock Grove was draped in the gaudy shroud of Halloween. Every porch displayed a grinning or grimacing pumpkin, their candlelit faces winking in the early darkness. Synthetic cobwebs choked hedges and lampposts, and plastic skeletons dangled from trees, their limbs clicking in the wind. Children in half-donned costumes darted across lawns, their laughter sharp and metallic in the cold air. Herbert, a quiet man who worked as a restorer of old books, felt the holiday as a rising pressure, a collective madness he was forever on the outside of. He lived alone in the old house his grandparents had left him, its rooms filled with the smell of leather, glue, and the slow, patient dust of paper. That evening, driven by a compulsion he didn't understand, he returned to the spot where he had woken up. The October sun was a dying ember, staining the world in shades of blood orange and deep violet. The wind whispered through the cornfield that separated his land from the Greenwood woods, a dry, papery rustle that sounded like secrets. And that S, when he heard it, a soft, mewling cry, a sound of pure, helpless distress. It came from a drainage pipe that ran under the access road to the old facility. He knelt, the cold of the concrete biting through his knees, and peered into the dark, circular mouth of the pipe. The smell that wafted out was complex and unsettling, not just damp and decay, but something else, a sharp, clean scent like ozone after a lightning strike. The mewling came again, closer this time. He reached a hand into the darkness, his fingers brushing against something warm, something alive. It flinched, then pressed into his palm. It was fur, impossibly soft, and beneath it, a frantic, bird-like heartbeat. He carefully drew the creature out. It fit into his two cupped hands, a thing of impossible anatomy. Its body was covered in that plush, grayish fur, but its face was almost canine, with large, liquid black eyes that held an intelligence that was immediately, profoundly human. Its limbs were delicate, ending in tiny, almost hand-like paws. It looked up at him, and the fear in its eyes softened into a quiet, desperate trust. It was clearly a product of Greenwood, a secret that had escaped its cage. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the October air, that he could not leave it. He named it, for no reason he could articulate, Lysander. He smuggled Lysander into his house, into the sanctuary of his study. The creature was weak, trembling, and it drank warm milk from a dropper with a pathetic eagerness. As the days until Halloween dwindled, a strange domesticity settled over Herbert S. life. Lysander S. intelligence was staggering. It learned words, not through mimicry, but through comprehension. Herbert would point to book and say page, and Lysander would gently tap a paw on the paper. It seemed to understand emotions, nuzzling his hand when he felt the familiar ache of loneliness, its large eyes reflecting a deep, unnerving empathy. It was a gentle companion, born from a place of horror, a spark of pure consciousness in a form that was never meant to be. But the woods were not quiet. On the night of the 29th, a dog went missing from a neighboring farm. Then another. The news reports were brief, blaming coyotes, but the details were wrong. There were no remains, no signs of a struggle, just an absence. Herbert, walking to the edge of his property, with Lysander hidden inside his coat, felt a new tension in the air. The Halloween decorations now seemed less festive and more like desperate talismans against a genuine, encroaching dark. The scarecrow in the Miller S. field, a lopsided thing in a flannel shirt, seemed to have turned its burlap head, its painted eyes now staring directly toward the Greenwood woods. He confided in Brittany, the owner of the local antique shop, where he sometimes found materials for his work. She was a practical woman with eyes the color of the autumn sky, and a skepticism born from a hard life. He showed her Lysander, expecting disbelief, but she only looked at the creature, then at Herbert S. terrified, hopeful face, and nodded slowly. "They made something else, too, didn't they?" she said, her voice barely a whisper. The trust in her eyes, the immediate alliance, felt like the first solid ground he had found in years. Together, they pieced together the nightmare. Using old blueprints and declassified documents Brittany dug up from the town archives, they learned that Greenwood S. final, doomed project was codenamed Chimera. It wasn't one experiment, but two, twin gestations, one intended for cognitive augmentation, the other for physical resilience and aggression. The project logs spoke of subject alpha and subject beta. Lysander was Alpha, the success, a mind blossoming in a fragile body. Beta was the failure, a creature of pure instinct and rage that had breached containment the night the facility was shuttered. It had been living in the woods, feeding, growing, and waiting. And the thinning veil of Halloween, they feared, was giving it a new kind of power, a resonance with the ancient wildness of the night. On October 30th, the town was gripped by a frantic energy. Children carved pumpkins, their parents roasting pumpkin seeds, the air thick with the sweet, waxy smell of candlelit gourds. But beneath the festive preparations, a real fear was spreading. The sheriff warned people to keep their pets indoors. Parents looked nervously at the deepening shadows between houses. That night, Herbert and Brittany sat in his study, Lysander sleeping peacefully in a nest of old blankets. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and the candle inside the jack-o'-lantern on Herbert's desk guttered, casting frantic, dancing shadows. "It's hunting for something more than food now," Brittany said, staring into the flame. "It's the season. The stories say the veil is thin. Maybe it's trying to tear a hole all the way through." As if on cue, a sound ripped through the wind, a long, guttural shriek that was part cougar, part something infinitely older and more wrong. It was a sound that didn't belong in the world of men and streetlights and candy apples. It was a sound from a time when the dark held real teeth. Lysander woke with a start, his body trembling violently, his intelligent eyes wide with a terror that was not just his own, but a reflection of the predator outside. He looked at Herbert, and with a clarity that was heartbreaking, projected a single, blurred image into Herbert's mind. A vast, dark shape moving through the corn, its form shifting and indistinct, and a single, overwhelming emotion hunger. Halloween dawned cold and bright, a cruel parody of a perfect autumn day. The sunlight was thin and carried no warmth. By noon, the news broke. A man was dead, a hiker found torn apart in the state park. The official story was a bear attack, but the whispers in the coffee shop and the post office told a different story. The shadowy forces that had once run Greenwood arrived in unmarked black vans. Men in dark suits walked the perimeter of the woods, their faces blank, their movements efficient. They were not there to protect the town. They were there to clean up a mess, to retrieve their property, living or dead. The magic hour arrived. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the world turned orange and black. Trick-or-treaters flooded the streets, a riot of tiny ghosts and superheroes, their laughter echoing under the streetlights. The air was thick with the smell of burning leaves and the sugary perfume of spilled candy. Herbert and Brittany watched from his window. Lysander was hidden in a reinforced chest, silent and terrified. The plan was to wait, to hide, to let the night pass. But the predator had other plans. It was drawn to the life, the energy, the sheer vulnerability of the night. It was no longer just an escaped experiment. It had become a creature of folklore, a thing of Halloween, wearing the skin of the season's deepest fears. They heard it first on the edge of the neighborhood screams that were not the playful shrieks of frightened children, but raw, genuine terror. The streetlights on the block flickered and died, plunging the street into an orange-tinted gloom lit only by the leering jack-o'-lanterns. It emerged from between two houses. It was larger than a man, a nightmare of mismatched biology. Its hide was a patchwork of thick, scarred skin and bare, muscular flesh. It moved on all fours, but its limbs were all wrong, articulating in ways that suggested multiple creatures fused into one. Its head was a horror, with too many eyes and a mouth that opened like a fleshy flower, revealing rows of serrated, needle-like teeth. It was Beta, the embodiment of man's reckless tampering, now fully realized as a Halloween monster. The men in dark suits moved in, tranquilizer rifles raised. But the creature was fast, a blur of rage and motion. It swatted them aside like toys, their bodies crumpling against trees and parked cars. Its focus was not on them. It was fixed on Herbert's house. It could smell its twin. It could smell the bond that had formed, the loyalty and love that it itself had been denied. That bond was an offense to its solitary, hateful existence. It crashed through the front door, splintering the wood. The house shook. Herbert shoved Brittany toward the back door, but it was too late. The creature was in the hallway, its breath a foul, hot wind that smelled of blood and old earth. Its multitude of eyes locked onto Herbert. In that moment, he saw not just mindless aggression, but a deep, cosmic jealousy, a rage at its own loneliness. Lysander, from his hiding place, let out a high, pure note of sound, a call that was both a warning and a plea. The predator's head snapped toward the sound. It forgot Herbert and lunged for the study. Herbert acted on an instinct he didn't know he possessed. He grabbed the heavy, metal-based reading lamp from his desk, and as the creature tore the lid from the chest, he brought the lamp down on its skull with all his strength. There was a wet, cracking sound. The creature roared, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony, and whirled, swiping a clawed limb that caught Herbert across the chest, shredding his shirt and the skin beneath. He fell, the world swimming in a haze of pain. The creature loomed over him, its flower-like mouth opening wide, ready to deliver the final bite. Then a small, gray form launched itself from the chest. Lysander moved with a speed and ferocity Herbert had never seen. He did not attack the larger creature. Instead, he scrambled up its body and placed his small, hand-like paws on either side of its monstrous head. He closed his large, black eyes. A silent detonation filled the room. It was not a sound, but a pressure wave of pure psychic energy. Herbert felt it as a sudden, vacuum-like silence that sucked the air from his lungs. The predator, Beta, froze. Its many eyes widened, not in pain, but in a sudden, shocking comprehension. It was seeing itself, not as a monster, but as the other, the brother, the lost twin. It was feeling, for the first and last time, the connection it had always sought through destruction. A single, clear tear, thick and oily, traced a path down its scarred hide. Then, with a shudder that ran through its entire frame, the great beast collapsed. It did not move again. The men in suits found them like that. Herbert bleeding on the floor, Brittany kneeling beside him, and Lysander curled on the still chest of the creature, his small body exhausted, his fur matted with something that was not blood. The men collected the body of Beta without a word. One of them, a man with a face like granite, looked at Lysander, then at Herbert. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he simply turned and walked away, leaving them in the wreckage of the house. They had seen what Lysander could do. They knew he was not a weapon to be controlled, but a mystery to be feared. Some doors, once opened, are best left closed. Weeks passed. The bite of November settled in. The pumpkins on the porches rotted, caving in on themselves, their grins collapsing into grimaces of decay. The cornfields were stubble. The world moved on. On a cold, clear night near the end of the month, Herbert and Brittany sat together on his repaired porch. The horror had bound them, a shared secret that was both a wound and a foundation. Lysander was between them, nestled in the folds of a blanket, his intelligent eyes watching the stars. He was quieter now, the echo of his twin S rage a permanent shadow in his mind. Herbert looked down at his hands, then at the quiet, sleeping town. The struggle was over, the survival assured for now. But the memory of that Halloween night was not a scar that faded. It was a color that had permanently stained his vision of the world. He had looked into the abyss of man's ambition and seen the two children it had birthed, one of terrible love, one of terrible rage. He had learned that loyalty could be a weapon, and that love could be a shield, but that some creations could never be unmade. He reached out and laid a hand gently on Lysander's back, feeling the soft, warm fur, the steady, quiet breath, the profound and alien life humming within. In the dark, glassy surface of the window pane, his own reflection was faint, a ghost superimposed over the warm light of the house behind him. And just for a moment, as a cloud passed over the moon, the reflection seemed to shift. The outline of his head seemed to swell and distort, and in the blackness where his face should be, 2 points of orange light flickered, then glowed, like the steady, watchful flames deep within a freshly carved jack-o'-lantern. He blinked, and the reflection was just his own again, tired and pale. He shook his head, a faint tremor in his hand as he pulled it back from the window glass. It was just fatigue, the lingering shock, a trick of the light. Brittany, sensing his unease, placed her hand over his, her touch solid and real. Inside, the house was different. The splintered doorframe had been replaced, the claw marks on the floorboards sanded and varnished over. But the silence that now filled the rooms was new. It was a watchful silence, a listening silence. It was the quiet of the woods after a predator has passed, a quiet that knows it is only temporary. Lysander spent his days now in the sunlit patch on the study floor, his gaze often distant, turned inward to a landscape Herbert could not see. He still learned, his comprehension of language deepening, but he no longer initiated play. or sought out affection with the same eager trust. He was grieving, Herbert realized. He was mourning the other half of his own impossible existence, the brother whose only language had been violence, but whose absence had left a silent, screaming chord in the world. One evening, Herbert found a single, long, gray hair on the cover of a book he was restoring. It was coarse, unlike Lysander S. plush fur. He held it up to the light, his blood running cold. It was from the other one. It must have been caught in the blanket Lysander had been curled on. He thought about the men in suits, their cold efficiency. They had taken the body, but had they truly cleaned up? Or had they, in their haste, missed pieces, seeds of the horror, left to be scattered by the wind? He did not show the hair to Brittany. He did not want to plant this new fear in her. Instead, he sealed it inside a small glass vial and hid it at the back of a drawer, a relic of a night he desperately wanted to believe was over. But that night, his sleepwalking returned. He woke standing at the back door, his hand on the knob, the cold of the night seeping through the wood. Through the window, the greenwood woods were a solid wall of black. And for a moment, he thought he saw a flicker of movement, a shudder in the shadows that was too deliberate for an animal. The next morning, a light snow dusted the ground, the first of the season. When Herbert went out to get firewood, he found a single set of footprints leading from the tree line to the edge of his porch. They were large, deep, and unmistakably human. They stopped at the bottom step, as if someone had stood there for a long time, looking in. And then they turned and walked back, disappearing into the woods. They had left no trace of their arrival, only their departure. It was a message. The silence was over. The watching had begun again. He did not call the sheriff. He knew, with a cold certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this was not a matter for the police. This was a continuation. He swept the steps, erasing the evidence, his movements calm and deliberate. The snow continued to fall, a gentle, silent eraser, but it could not cover the truth now taking root in his mind. Brittany noticed the change in him. He was quieter, more focused, his gaze often drifting toward the window that faced the woods. When she asked, he lied. He told her it was just the season, the shortening days. He could not bear to pull her back into the fear, not when she had just begun to sleep through the night again. This was his burden, his inheritance from that Halloween night. He was the keeper of the secret, and now, it seemed, he was also the one being kept. Lysander felt it too. The creature became restless, his large eyes fixed on the same window, a low, thrumming vibration sometimes emanating from his small body. It was not a sound, but a feeling, a resonance that made the fine hairs on Herbert S. arms stand on end. It was a frequency of awareness, a silent alarm. One afternoon, Herbert found Lysander sitting before the hidden drawer, his tiny paw resting on the wood, as if he could feel the single, coarse hair sealed within the glass vial. The following week, a new family moved into the old Miller farm. They were cheerful, oblivious, their moving truck a bright, garish yellow in the muted winter landscape. They had 2 young children who immediately began building a snowman in the front yard. Herbert watched them from his study, a knot of dread tightening in his stomach. Their property line backed directly onto the Greenwood woods. That night, the family's dog, a golden retriever, began to bark. It was not the usual bark at a passing car or a squirrel. It was a frantic, terrified sound that escalated into a high-pitched whine and then stopped altogether. Abruptly, the silence that followed was heavier than the snow. Herbert stood in the dark of his study, his forehead pressed against the cold glass, and watched the dark tree line. He saw nothing, but he felt it. A presence, patient and cold, observing the new lights, the new sounds, the new life that had been brought so close to its territory. The next morning, the dog was gone. The family searched all day, their calls becoming increasingly desperate. Flyers were posted. The sheriff came and went. Herbert said nothing. He simply went to his workshop and began to sharpen his old wood-cutting axe. The action was methodical, the scrape of the file against the metal a grim, rhythmic counterpoint to the cheerful holiday music playing from a radio in the town. He was not preparing to attack. He was preparing to defend. The line had been drawn again, not in the soil of his property, but in the deeper soil of his life. The thing in the woods was not gone. It had simply learned a new kind of patience, and it was reminding Herbert that their story was not over. The axe felt heavy and unfamiliar in Herbert's hands, a tool from a simpler past, now repurposed for a future he had never wanted. He stored it behind the repaired front door, the cool weight of the steel a small, cold comfort. Brittany saw it there, her eyes widening for a moment before a grim understanding settled over her features. She didn't ask. She just nodded, a silent pact reforged between them. Life became a performance of normalcy played out on a stage they knew was being watched. Herbert went to the library, Brittany to her shifts at the clinic. But their smiles were tight, their laughter a forced and brittle sound. Their attention was always divided, a part of them perpetually listening, perpetually scanning the tree line. Lysander became their sentinel. He no longer slept in sunbeams, but took up a post on the study's windowsill, a small, gray statue against the glass, his gaze fixed on the woods. The low, thrumming vibration he emitted was now a near-constant presence, a psychic shield humming at the edge of perception. The new family, the Wilsons, were a stark contrast to their own watchful silence. They strung cheerful, multicolored lights along their roof, their laughter echoing across the snowy field as they built a lopsided snow fort. Their grief for their lost dog was real, but it was the open, honest grief of those who believe a tragedy is an isolated event. They had no concept of the pattern, of the predatory intelligence that saw their home not as a residence, but as a larder that had been conveniently restocked. A few days before Christmas, a social worker from the county and a man in a crisp, unmarked jacket visited the Wilsons. Herbert watched from his window, his heart a cold stone in his chest. The man did not drive a black van, but his posture, the sharp cut of his suit, and the way he scanned the property with a detached, analytical gaze were unmistakable. They were the same kind of men, just a different department. The cleanup crew was checking on the neighborhood, ensuring the containment was still holding. The man's eyes lingered on Herbert S. house for a moment too long before he followed Mrs. Wilson inside. That evening, the thrumming from Lysander intensified into a sharp, psychic spike. Herbert was in the kitchen, and the sensation was so acute he dropped a glass into the sink, where it shattered. At the same moment, from the Wilson S. house, came a single, piercing scream. It was the mother. Herbert and Brittany reached their window in time to see the social worker, and the suit ushering the terrified family into a waiting sedan. The family moved like sleepwalkers, their faces blank with a shock that seemed administered, not organic. The car pulled away quickly, its tires spitting snow, and did not return. The Wilson house stood dark and empty after that, its cheerful lights left on, a silent, blinking monument to a story that had been officially erased. The silence that returned to the field was absolute. It was the silence of a quarantine zone. 2 nights later, Herbert was woken not by a sound, but by a sudden absence. The constant, low-level hum from Lysander had stopped. He sat up in bed, his breath pluming in the frigid air. The house was cold, colder than it should have been. He found Lysander in the study, not on the windowsill, but standing in the middle of the room, facing the back door. The creature's small body was rigid, every hair on end. He was not looking at the door, but through it. Herbert followed his gaze. There, in the fresh snow on the porch, was a single, perfect item. It was a child's teddy bear, one Herbert recognized from the Wilson S. yard. It was not torn or dirty. It had been placed with deliberate care directly in front of the door, its button eyes staring blankly up at the house. It was not a threat. It was a message, an offering, a promise that the waiting was a game, and the game was far from over. Herbert looked from the bear to the dark wall of the woods, and he knew. Beta was gone, but the void it left had not simply vanished. The woods had absorbed its essence, its rage, its hunger. The experiment was over, but the consequence was just beginning to live. He did not bring the bear inside. To touch, it felt like accepting a terms of engagement he wanted no part of. He left it there on the porch, a forlorn sentinel in the deepening cold, and went back inside, locking the door and leaning the axe against it. The house felt different now. The repaired walls seemed thinner, the new door a flimsy barrier against intelligence that communicated in lost pets and stolen toys. Brittany found him at the kitchen table at dawn, staring at his hands. He didn't need to tell her. She had seen the bear through the window. She made coffee, the simple, domestic ritual feeling both absurd and essential. "We can't stay here," she said, her voice quiet but firm. It was the first time either of them had given the thought words. "Where would we go?" Herbert asked, not looking up. "And how would we explain it? And what would they do to him?" He nodded toward the study where Lysander was, the hum of his presence still absent, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. "They know about him. They let us keep him because they saw what he did. If we run, we become a variable. They don't like variables, so we're just supposed to wait for that thing out there to get bored, to decide we're next. Her voice trembled on the last word. Herbert finally looked at her, his eyes hollow. It's not a thing, Britt. Not like an animal. It's a pattern, a behavior. It learned from its brother. Beta sought a bond through violence because it was all it knew. This is different. It's learning to be patient. It's learning to be cruel. The days that followed were a study in tension. The bear remained on the porch, slowly being buried by fresh snow, a lumpen shape that was a constant reminder of the violation. Herbert took to walking the perimeter of his property every morning, the axe held loosely in his hand. He was not hunting. He was marking his territory, asserting a claim he felt slipping away with every silent hour. It was on one of these walks that he found the first stone. It was nestled in the crook of a tree at the edge of the woods, a smooth, river-worn stone that was too perfectly placed to be natural. The next day, there was another, this one balanced on top of a fence post. They were not threatening in themselves, but their placement was. It was a language, a slow, deliberate sentence being written around his home. Lysander began to change. His quiet grief was replaced by a new alertness. He started bringing Herbert things, not books or tools, but objects from the house. A single spoon, a burnt-out light bulb, a key from a lock Herbert hadn't opened in years. He would drop them at Herbert's feet and look up at him, his large black eyes intense, as if trying to convey a complex idea with these simple, random nouns. Herbert felt a chilling certainty that it was not random. Lysander was trying to build a vocabulary to describe the indescribable presence in the woods, using the only symbols he had. The final stone appeared on the morning of the winter solstice. It was on their porch, placed directly in the center. The teddy bear was gone. In its place was a small, neat pile of what looked like sticks. When Herbert looked closer, his stomach turned to ice. They were not sticks. They were the carefully cleaned and broken bones of a bird. Arranged next to them was a single, bright red feather. That was the day the humming returned. But it was different. It was no longer a shield or an alarm. It was a song, a low, complex, and strangely melodic thrumming that seemed to resonate not in the air, but in the marrow of Herbert's bones. Lysander sat in the middle of the living room, producing this sound, his eyes closed in concentration. He was not facing the woods anymore. He was facing Herbert and Brittany. He is not warning us, Herbert realized with a dawning, terrifying awe. He is teaching us. He is trying to make us understand the song, because the thing in the woods has its own song, and we are all going to have to learn how to sing. The song wove through the house for the rest of the day, a thread of vibration that tied them all together. Herbert found that if he stopped fighting it, if he let the hum settle into his own chest, a strange clarity descended. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his gut, but it was now surrounded by a wider, more ancient awareness. He could feel the weight of the snow on the roof, the slow, sleeping breath of the trees at the edge of the property, the frantic heartbeat of a mouse in the walls. Lysander was opening a door inside his mind, and a flood of sensory information he had never known existed was pouring through. Brittany could not hear it the same way. To her, it was a sound that gave her a headache, a pressure behind her eyes that made her irritable and anxious. She watched Herbert and Lysander with a new kind of fear, the fear of being left behind, of losing them to a frequency she could not access. The divide in the house was no longer just between them and the woods. It was now within their own walls. As dusk fell on the solstice, the shortest day of the year, the song from Lysander changed again. It became a single, sustained note, a clear tone of focused attention. Herbert, who had been dozing in his chair, jerked awake. The note was a pointer. It was aimed directly at the Wilson house. Without a word, Herbert stood and walked to the window. The empty house was a dark silhouette against the violet twilight. For a long time, he saw nothing. Then, a light flickered in an upstairs window. It was not the warm, wavering light of a candle, but the cool, steady glow of a modern flashlight. It moved from one window to the next, a methodical search. The men in suits were back. They were conducting their own watch, cleaning up the last loose ends of the Wilson story. Herbert felt a surge of bitter triumph. They thought they were the only hunters in these woods. They had no idea they were also being hunted. The flashlight beam disappeared from the upstairs and reappeared a moment later in the ground floor living room. It paused, trained on the back wall, the wall that faced the woods. Then, the light began to jerk and dance wildly. It swept across the ceiling, then the floor, a frantic, panicked staccato. Herbert saw a shadow, huge and distorted, cross the window. There was no sound. The light simply went out. The silence that followed was more terrible than any scream. Herbert turned from the window. Lysander had stopped his song. The little creature was looking at him, and in his eyes was no fear, no triumph, only a profound and weary knowledge. He had not been trying to fight the thing in the woods. He had been trying to introduce it. He had been showing it a new source of attention, a new set of players for its game. The men in the house were not victims. They were an answer, a diversion, a meal. Herbert picked up the axe from behind the door. Its weight was familiar now, an extension of his own arm. He did not look at Brittany, who was watching him with wide, terrified eyes. He looked at Lysander. It is not enough to understand the song, he thought. You have to be willing to sing back. He walked to the back door and opened it. The cold night air rushed in, but he did not feel it. He stepped out onto the porch, his boots crunching on the snow. He did not look toward the Wilson house. He looked straight into the blackness of the Greenwood woods, toward the source of the pattern, the patient, cruel intelligence that had been teaching him its language. He took a deep breath, and from a place deeper than thought, he let out a low, guttural hum. It was a poor imitation of Lysander's complex song, a single, rough note of defiance. It was not a shield. It was a challenge. From deep within the woods, something answered. It was not a sound that traveled through the air, but a vibration that traveled through the frozen ground, up through the soles of his feet and into his bones. It was a single, resonant note that acknowledged his presence, that recognized his voice. The game had changed. The quiet was over for good. The vibration in the ground ceased, but the echo of it remained inside him, a new and permanent sense. He stood there on the porch for a long time, the axe held ready, waiting for a sign, a movement, anything. But the woods offered nothing. It had accepted his challenge, and then retreated into an even deeper silence. A predator satisfied that the prey had finally shown its teeth. When he went back inside, Brittany was holding Lysander, her face pale. He saw the question in her eyes, and he had no answer to give. He simply shook his head and barred the door. That night, they did not sleep. They sat together in the living room, the three of them, listening to a silence that was now full of meaning. The house was no longer a sanctuary. It was a forward outpost. The next morning, a different car pulled into the Wilson driveway. Two men got out, their posture stiff, their faces grim. They were not the social worker or the suit from before. These men moved with a military efficiency, scanning the woods with a practiced paranoia that Herbert recognized. They were the next tier, the response team. They entered the house and emerged an hour later carrying a single, long black bag that was zipped shut. They did not look toward Herbert's house. They loaded the bag, got in their car, and left. The operation was clean, clinical, and utterly silent. Herbert knew then that the official story would be a simple one. A tragic accident, an animal attack, a closure. The file on the Wilson family was permanently sealed, and he knew with a chilling certainty that he and Brittany were now outside that file. They were an anomaly the system had not yet decided how to handle. Life did not return to normal. A new routine established itself, built around a constant, low-grade vigilance. Herbert continued his morning patrols, the axe a familiar weight. Brittany learned to read the new tension in his shoulders, the specific way he would pause and stare into the trees. She still could not hear the song, but she learned to see its effects. She saw the way Herbert and Lysander would sometimes turn their heads in unison, as if listening to a distant whisper. Lysander no longer brought Herbert random objects. Instead, he would sit with him for hours, the low thrum of his presence a constant lesson. Herbert's ability to perceive the world through this new sense grew. He could feel the shift in the air when a storm was coming, not from barometric pressure, but from the restless energy in the clouds themselves. He could feel the life in the soil beneath the snow, the dormant potential waiting for spring. And he could feel the presence in the woods. It was no longer a vague dread, but a specific location, a cold, focused point of consciousness that watched and waited. It was watching him learn. One evening in late January, Herbert was in the workshop, sharpening the axe again, not out of necessity, but for the focus the ritual provided. The hum in the air shifted, becoming a series of soft, pulsed notes. He looked up at Lysander, who was on the workbench. The creature was looking toward the back of the property, his head tilted. The pulses were not a warning. They were a description. Herbert closed his eyes and let the feeling wash over him. He saw in his mind SI, not an image, but a concept. A pattern of movement. A path being traced through the undergrowth, not toward their house, but parallel to it, along the old creek bed. It was a patrol. The thing in the woods was walking its own perimeter, mirroring his. Herbert stood, the axe forgotten. He walked to the window and looked out. The moon was full, casting a blue-white light on the snow. He saw nothing, but he felt it, a slow, deliberate movement along the creek, a shadow within a shadow. It was showing him its routine. It was acknowledging his. This was the new language they shared, a vocabulary of territory and attention. He heard a soft step behind him. Brittany was there, her arms crossed against the cold. She followed his gaze out the window, seeing nothing but moonlit trees and snow. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He didn't know how to explain it. He couldn't tell her that the monster was teaching him its habits, that they were engaged in a silent, terrible dialogue. He just shook his head and put his arm around her. "It's just walking," he said finally. She leaned into him, and they stood there together, watching the empty, knowing woods. The silence in the workshop was profound after that. Brittany did not ask for more. The simple, terrifying truth of his statement was enough. It was just walking. And the fact that Herbert knew this, that he could perceive it, meant that the line between them and it had been irrevocably blurred. Days bled into weeks. A tense standoff conducted in silence and subtle vibrations. Herbert's perception grew sharper, more nuanced. He could now distinguish the thing's passive presence, a cold ember at the heart of the woods, from its active attention, which felt like a searchlight sweeping across his property. He learned to still his own mind when that attention passed over him, to become part of the background hum of the house and the land, just another piece of the scenery. It was a hunter-esque trick, and he was the prey learning to hide in plain sight. Lysander was his constant tutor. The little creature's song became more complex, introducing Herbert to the textures of the world he had never sensed. He learned the taste of different kinds of silence, the brittle quiet of a frozen branch, the deep, patient silence of stone. He felt the life threads of every creature within 100 yards, a tangled web of fleeting heartbeats and instinctual fears. He was learning the grammar of a world that existed just beneath the surface of his own. Brittany watched this transformation with a heart full of conflict. The man she loved was receding, replaced by someone quieter, more distant, his eyes often focused on something she could not see. She tried to bridge the gap with the mundane. She baked bread, the yeast smell a defiant claim on normalcy. She mended clothes and played old records, filling the house with the scratchy sound of human voices. But the silence always returned, heavier than before. One afternoon in early February, the dynamic shifted. Herbert was splitting wood behind the shed when he felt it. The presence in the woods was not just present, not just watching. It was focused on him with an intensity that was almost physical, a pressure against his skin. He stopped, the axe halfway through a log, and turned slowly to face the tree line. There, between two ancient pines, stood a figure. It was not a solid form, but a shape made of shadow and suggestion, a man-like silhouette that seemed to drink the light from the air around it. It had no discernible face, no features, only a profound emptiness that held his gaze. It did not move. It simply stood, a statue of concentrated absence, and Herbert knew it was looking directly at him. This was not a patrol. This was an introduction. Lysander, who had been sitting on the woodpile, let out a soft, chittering sound, a series of clicks that Herbert now understood as a sign of intense, almost academic, interest. He was not afraid. He was observing. Herbert did not raise the axe. He did not make a sound. He simply stood his ground and met the gaze of the void. He let the thing feel his own presence, not as a threat or a plea, but as a simple, unyielding fact. I am here. I see you. The standoff lasted for a full minute. Then, as silently as it had appeared, the figure dissolved. It did not retreat into the woods. It simply unraveled, its darkness bleeding back into the shadows between the trees, until there was nothing left to see. Herbert let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. His hands were trembling. That night, he told Brittany what he had seen. He spared no detail, describing the formless shape and the crushing weight of its attention. She listened, her face growing paler with each word, but she did not interrupt. When he finished, she was silent for a long time. It showed itself to you, she said finally, her voice thin. Why? Because we're talking now, Herbert replied, his own voice weary. It's moved past leaving notes. It's starting a conversation. And what do we say back? She asked, the fear in her eyes giving way to a desperate, steely resolve. Herbert looked from her face to Lysander, who was watching them both, his large eyes reflecting the lamplight. He thought of the vibration in the ground, the patrol along the creek, the silent figure in the trees. I don't know, he admitted, but we're going to have to find an answer soon. It's learning how to speak to us, and I think it expects a reply. The reply came not from them, but from the world outside. 2 days later, a hard, official knock sounded on their front door. Herbert opened it to find a woman and a man standing on his porch. They were not in suits, but in the crisp, practical uniforms of the State Forestry Service. Their badges gleamed in the weak winter sun. Herbert Bell? The woman asked, her voice polite, but devoid of warmth. We were conducting a routine survey of wildlife activity in the Greenwood. We had some reports of unusual predator behavior. A missing hiker. Herbert's blood ran cold. He knew the name they would say before the man added it. Young man named Ray. Last seen on the trails near the Wilson property a week ago. You haven't seen anything, have you? tracks, strange sounds. They were lying. He could feel it. The lie was a thin, brittle shell over a deep, cold purpose. These were not foresters. They were the same kind of people who had taken the black bag from the Wilson house, just wearing a different uniform. They were looking for a new story to explain a new disappearance, and their search had led them to his door. Herbert forced his face into a mask of weary confusion. A hiker? No, we keep to ourselves. The woods have been quiet. He put a slight emphasis on the last word, attest. The woman's eyes flickered past him, into the house. She was scanning, assessing. Her gaze lingered on Brittany, who was standing stiffly by the fireplace, and then dropped to the floor where Lysander usually sat. The space was empty. Herbert had felt the creature slip into the kitchen the moment before the knock came. Quiet can be deceiving, the man said, his smile not reaching his eyes. We'd like to take a look around your property, if you don't mind. Standard procedure. It was not a request. Herbert knew that refusing would mark him, would make him a subject of interest. He nodded slowly, stepping aside. Of course. Do what you have to. He watched them from the window as they moved across his land with a predatory grace. They didn't look at the ground for tracks. They looked at the tree line, their hands never far from their hips, where their sidearms were hidden by their jackets. They were not searching for clues. They were scanning for a target. When they returned to the porch, their politeness was even thinner. We appreciate your cooperation, Mr. Bell, the woman said. We'll be in the area for a while. If you see anything, here us our card. She handed him a plain white card with a phone number and no names. They left, their truck kicking up gravel. Herbert stood at the door until the sound of the engine faded. He looked down at the card in his hand. It was blank on the back. He crumpled it into a tight ball. Brittany came to his side. They weren't foresters, she whispered. No, Herbert agreed. They were hunters. And they were not just hunting it. They were hunting anything that been near it. He turned and saw Lysander peering from the kitchen doorway. The creature's expression was unreadable, but the hum in the air had changed. It was a low, wary frequency, the sound of a calculation being made. That night, the thing in the woods made its move. Herbert was jolted from a shallow sleep by a new sensation, a sharp, piercing note that was not sound, but pure intent. It was a command, an invitation. He got out of bed and went to the window. The moon was hidden behind clouds, but he didn't need light to see. He could feel the path laid out for him, a vibrating line of attention that started at the edge of his porch and led straight into the heart of the woods. It was the same path the figure had shown him. It was calling him. He dressed in the dark, his movements quiet and deliberate. He did not take the axe. This was not a challenge. This was a summons. As he pulled on his boots, he felt a small, cool hand on his arm. Brittany was there, her eyes wide with terror. "You can tea," she breathed. "I have to," he said. "It has asked for me. If I don't go, it will come here, or it will send them." He nodded in the direction the false foresters had gone. "Then I am coming with you." No, the word was absolute. You have to stay with Lysander. You have to be quiet. You have to be still. No matter what you hear, you do not come outside. He saw the protest in her eyes and crushed it with his own. "This is the reply, Brittany. This is our answer." He kissed her forehead, a quick, hard gesture, and then he turned and walked down the hall. Lysander was waiting by the back door. He looked up at Herbert, and for the first time, Herbert saw something like regret in his dark eyes. Then the creature turned and melted into the shadows of the living room, his job as interpreter seemingly over. Herbert opened the door and stepped out into the freezing night. The path glowed in his mind, a thread of cold fire. He did not look back. He walked off the porch and across the snow toward the waiting trees. The woods opened before him, and the darkness swallowed him whole. The path was not a physical trail, but a pull, a current in the still air that guided his steps. He moved without hesitation, the frozen twigs snapping under his boots like small bones. The woods were different now. They were not just trees and snow. They were an extension of the presence. Every branch a nerve, every patch of shadow a watching eye. He felt the life threads of the forest creatures pull tight and retreat as he passed. A wave of fear preceding him. He walked for what felt like miles, though his rational mind told him the greenwood was not that deep. The pull led him down into a ravine where the creek lay under a plate of ice, and up the other side to a clearing he had never seen before. The moon broke through the clouds, illuminating a circle of ancient, twisted pines. In the center of the clearing, the air shimmered, a heat haze in the dead of winter. The figure from the trees was there, but it was no longer a silhouette. It was coalescing, drawing substance from the shadows and the cold, becoming more defined. It was tall and unnaturally thin, its limbs elongated. It had no face, only a smooth, pale expanse where features should be, reflecting the moonlight like polished stone. It stood perfectly still, waiting. Herbert stopped at the edge of the clearing. His heart was a frantic drum against his ribs, but his mind was preternaturally calm. This was the source, the singer, the patient intelligence that had haunted the edges of his life. It did not speak in words. A concept bloomed in Herbert S. mind, clear and cold as ice. It was an image of a web, intricate and vast, with the creature at its center. And he saw himself, a new, bright node in that web, connected by a thrumming strand of awareness. The image was followed by a question, not in language, but in pure intent. A question of place, of belonging. It was not asking for submission. It was asking for integration. Herbert understood then the true nature of the song. It was not a weapon or a shield. It was a network, a way of perceiving and controlling the world. The Wilsons had failed to join. They had been pruned. The hiker, Ray, had been an intruder removed. But he, Herbert, had sung back. He had learned the language. He was a candidate. He thought of Brittany, alone and terrified in the house. He thought of the false foresters with their cold eyes and hidden guns. He thought of the black bag being carried away. There was no going back to the world before. That world was already closing in, and it saw him as a problem to be solved. He looked at the faceless thing, at the terrible offer it presented. It was not safety. It was not peace. It was power of a kind, and a place within a system that was as ancient as it was merciless. He took a step forward into the clearing. The air grew colder, thick with static. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Instead, he focused everything he had learned, every vibration, every shift in the silence, every thread of life he could feel around him. He wove it together not into a song of defiance, but into a single, complex note of acceptance. The figure inclined its head. A long, slender arm, white as birch bark, lifted and gestured to the ground at its feet. From the shadows at the edge of the clearing, a new shape emerged. It was another of the creatures, smaller, its form less distinct. It moved with a familiar, skittering grace. It stopped a few feet from Herbert and looked up at him with large, dark eyes. It was Lysander, or what had once been Lysander. The familiar, almost pet-like presence was gone, replaced by a calm, ancient intelligence. The little creature that had brought him gifts and taught him the song had been a scout, a larval form. This was its true state, a mature node in the web. Lysander reached out a thin, cool hand and touched Herbert's leg. A jolt of pure understanding passed through him. He saw the web not as a trap, but as a symphony. He saw his role not as prey or master, but as a new instrument, his human perspective, a unique resonance the web had lacked. He knew what he had to do. He had to go back, not to hide, but to prepare. The web was not just in the woods. It needed to grow. He looked at the faceless being one last time and gave a slow, deliberate nod. The connection between them solidified, a permanent, silent channel now open. Then he turned and walked out of the clearing, the path back to his house now clear in his mind. Lysander did not follow him. His tutelage was over. Herbert walked alone, but he was not alone. The woods were no longer a threat. They were an extension of his own senses. He could feel the roots of the trees drinking from the earth, the sleep of a fox in its den, the approach of a vehicle still 2 miles away on the main road. It was the false foresters. They were coming back. Herbert picked up his pace, not with fear, but with a new, grim purpose. He had his answer for Brittany now. He knew what they had to say. The conversation with the world outside was just beginning, and they would need to speak with a united voice. A new voice, born from the heart of the greenwood. Story 2. It was the dust, I think, that made me notice it. A fine gray shroud, soft as ash, that had settled over everything in the attic in the 3 years since my father died. I was up there in the deep quiet of an October afternoon, the air thick with the ghosts of old summers and the chill of the coming winter, looking for a box of my mother's old photo albums. The light from the single bulb was weak, a jaundiced yellow that pushed back the shadows just enough to make them deeper. And there, in the far corner, tucked behind a splintered rocking horse with one glass eye missing, was the television. It wasn't a modern flat screen, all sleek and silent. This was a heavy, boxy thing from another century, the kind with a convex glass screen that reflected the attic's gloom like a murky pond. The casing was a fake wood grain, scarred and chipped, and the dials were large, clunky plastic knobs for VHF and UHF. A thick coat of dust lay upon it, so undisturbed it seemed a part of the object itself, a fungal growth. It looked less like an appliance and more like a relic, an altarpiece from a forgotten faith. I had no memory of it. It felt like it had been waiting. Something about it called to me, a low and persistent hum in my blood that was louder than common sense. I dragged it out, the dust motes dancing in frantic swirls, and carried its impossible weight down the pull-down stairs, my muscles protesting. I set it up in the living room, on the low oak cabinet where our modern television lived, which I unplugged and shoved aside. It looked alien there, a grotesque fossil in the heart of my comfortable, lonely house. The air in the room immediately changed, grew heavier, smelling of ozone and old, dry rot. It was the smell of a long-closed tomb. This was a week before Halloween, and the world outside was putting on its own, more cheerful, grotesque display. My small suburban street was a riot of orange and black. On every porch, jack-o'-lanterns leered with jagged, candlelit grins, their light flickering and dancing, making the shadows of wind-whipped branches writhe like skeletal fingers on the siding. The trees were almost bare, their stripped limbs clawing at a sky the color of lead. A carpet of crimson and burnt orange leaves covered the lawns, and they made a dry, scuttling sound like insect wings when the wind swept through. At night, the neighborhood children, shepherded by watchful parents, would trail down the sidewalks in their costumes, tiny superheroes, and glittering princesses, their laughter sharp and bright. Yet sometimes, from a distance, it sounded like something else, something brittle and frantic. I found a coaxial adapter in a junk drawer and screwed it into the back of the old set. My hand was trembling. I plugged the thick, brown power cord into the wall outlet. For a moment, nothing. Then, with a deep, mechanical thunk that vibrated through the floorboards, the television warmed to life. The screen remained dark, but a single, small, amber light glowed steadily below it. A low, electric hum filled the room, a sound so deep it was more a feeling in my teeth than a noise in my ears. I turned the large dial, static, a roaring, hissing snowstorm of black and white. I turned it again, more static, and again. Then, on channel 12, an image flickered into being. It was unstable, wavering, as if seen through a heat haze or a wall of falling water. The colors were wrong, too saturated, the reds too bloody, the greens sickly. It showed a man in a crisp, dark suit, standing at a podium bristling with microphones. He was handsome in a clean, sharp way, his hair perfectly styled, his smile a practiced, reassuring tool. "We are winning this fight," the man said, his voice tinny and slightly distorted through the television's single, small speaker. "The quarantine zones are secure. The infection is contained. Our brave men and women on the wall are the reason you can sleep safely in your beds at night. The reason your children can celebrate this coming Halloween." The image cut to a shot of a massive gray concrete wall, topped with razor wire and guard towers. It was the Cincinnati Wall, the barrier that separated our fragile pocket of controlled society from the vast, silent, green-tinged wilderness of the outzone. The camera panned along its imposing length, and for a fraction of a second, the image flickered. In that flicker, I saw something else. I saw the concrete was scarred with deep, parallel grooves, as if clawed by something immense. I saw dark, wet stains that the official broadcast did not show. Then it was back to the pristine, imposing fortification. The man at the podium was Drew, the regional administrator. His face was on every screen, his voice on every radio. He was the face of safety, of order, of the future. The broadcast returned to him. "We must remain vigilant," he said, his eyes looking directly into the camera, and it felt for a dizzying moment as if he were looking directly at me. Here in my dusty living room, with the October dark pressing against the windows. But we must also live. We must have our traditions, our Halloween. It reminds us what we are fighting for. The image dissolved into a commercial for a brand of synthetic candy. All neon colors and jingles that felt like a nervous tick. I turned the dial, and the screen returned to the hissing static. But the hum remained, that low, pervasive thrum in the bones of the house. My name is April. I was a blogger once, part of a small, scrappy team with my brother, Abraham. We covered the political landscape in the early days of the outbreak, back when the word zombie was still whispered, before the government sanitized it to infected. We were sharp, determined. We chased truths the way bloodhounds chase a scent. Abraham was the loyal sibling, my partner in everything, the steady hand to my frantic mind. He died 2 years ago during the Cleveland purge. An accidental breach, the report said. I never believed them. Sitting there, in the glow of the old television, the ghost of my old self stirred. The journalist, the seeker. The hum of the set seemed to sync with that old, restless part of me. The next day, I turned the dial again. The same channels, the same official broadcasts. But now I was watching for the flaws, the flickers. On a local news segment about Halloween safety reminding parents to check all candy for tampering. A hollow echo of a fear from a simpler time, the signal stuttered. For 3 frames, maybe 4, the smiling news anchor was gone. In her place was a face, gaunt and stretched, the skin a mottled gray-green, the eyes milky and vacant. The mouth was open in a silent, perpetual scream, and the teeth were stained black. Then it was back to the anchor, her smile never wavering, my breath caught in my throat. It was a glimpse of the world beyond the wall, the truth they were so carefully curating. The infected. They weren't just a threat, they were a reality that was being edited out of existence. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind had picked up, howling around the corners of the house, rattling the loose pane in the kitchen window. It was the night of the town's annual haunted hayride, and the sounds of distant, manufactured screams from the park down the road mixed with the wind. I went downstairs, drawn back to the television. The living room was cold, the kind of deep, autumnal cold that seeps into your bones. I didn't turn on the lamp. The only light came from the big picture window. The orange glow of the jack-o'-lanterns on the porches across the street, casting long, dancing shadows into the room. I turned on the television. The static roared. I turned the dial slowly, patiently. Past the infomercials, the old sitcoms, the official government channels broadcasting their soothing, repetitive lies. Then, on a channel that shouldn't have existed, a channel the dial clicked past with a gritty finality, there was another image. It was Abraham. The footage was grainy, dark, shot on a shaky handheld device. He was younger than I remembered, his face still full of the fierce, bright energy that had been his trademark. He was in an alley, somewhere in a city I didn't recognize. The buildings were bombed-out skeletons. He was talking to someone off camera, his voice a frantic whisper. They were not just containing it. Drew is weaponizing it, Abraham said, his eyes wide with a terror I had never seen in them before. The infection. They were stabilizing it. They think they can control it, direct it. They were not building a wall to keep them out. They were building a pen to keep them in. For the harvest. Screen filled with a burst of greenish static. When it cleared, the perspective had changed. It was a different clip, from a security camera maybe, looking down into a sterile, white-tiled room. Administrator Drew was there, in a protective suit, his handsome face visible through the clear plastic of the hood. He wasn't smiling. He was watching as figures in similar suits guided a shambling, gray-skinned figure and infected into a complex-looking harness. Wires were attached to its temples, its spine. The creature thrashed weakly, a low, guttural moan filtering through the television-S speaker, a sound that was utterly, profoundly wrong. Drew spoke, his voice filtered and metallic. The ultimate deterrent, a plague that thinks, a weapon that feels no pain, no fear, and needs no supply lines. Once we can imprint targeting parameters, the opposition will simply cease. The screen went black. The hum of the television seemed to swell, filling the entire house, vibrating in the fillings of my teeth. I was shaking, my hands clenched into fists, so tight my nails bit into my palms, weaponizing the infection. Drew, the smiling face of safety, was a monster far more calculating than the mindless things beyond the wall. Abraham had discovered it, and Abraham had died for it. The conspiracy wasn't just a political cover-up. It was a perversion of nature itself. They were taking the dead, the infected, and turning them into puppets. A harvest of bodies for a war without end. The days blurred together, a countdown to Halloween. The world outside my window became a grotesque parody of the horror I was uncovering. The plastic skeletons hanging from trees seemed to twist in the wind with a new, malicious intent. The fake cobwebs stretching across porch railings looked sticky and real, waiting for prey. The cheerful, grinning jack-o'-lantern on my own porch seemed to watch me with a knowing malevolence as I came and went. A sleep-deprived ghost in my own life. I spent every night with the television. It became my confessional, my window into the abyss. It showed me more. Fragments of data, schematics of the imprinting technology, lists of acquisition, sites, places where outbreaks had been tragically unavoidable. The hidden conspirators, faceless men in dark rooms, were planning something for Halloween night. A test, the files called it. Field Trial Alpha. The target was a non-compliant settlement just beyond the Cincinnati wall. They were going to unleash their weaponized dead. I was alone with this knowledge. Who could I tell? The media was a mouthpiece for the conspiracy. The authorities were its enforcers. I was just a woman with a ghost in a box, a blogger who had been silent for years. On October 30th, the tension in my neighborhood was a palpable thing. A wire stretched to breaking. The Halloween decorations seemed more aggressive, more sinister. The giant, inflatable black cat on the Larson S. lawn across the street seemed to track my movements with its glowing red eyes. The wind carried the sweet, cloying smell of rotting pumpkins from the compost pile behind my shed, mixed with the ever-present scent of wood smoke. The sky was a bruised purple, and an enormous, lopsided harvest moon hung in it, a great, watchful orange eye. That night, the television showed me Abraham one last time. He was in a dark space, maybe a basement or a tunnel. He was holding the camera himself, his face close to the lens. He was bleeding from a cut on his forehead. "April," he whispered, and the sound of my name, spoken by his ghost, sent a physical jolt through me. If you are seeing this, I am gone. They have it all, the proof. It S in the signal. They broadcast their lies on the public band, but their real communications, their plans, they ray piggybacking on the old analog frequencies. They think no one is listening there anymore. You have to break the signal. On the night, during the trial, you have to show everyone. Show them what S really coming to their door. He looked over his shoulder, fear stark in his eyes. It S all about the threshold, April. The veil. They ray using the old magic without even knowing it. All that focus, all that ancient fear on Halloween night, it thins the world. It gives their imprinting signal more purchase, more power. Don T let them open the door. The screen went to static. The hum was so loud, now it was a constant pressure in my skull. I knew what I had to do. It was insane. It was suicidal. But Abraham was with me, in the static, in the hum, in the very dust of this ancient machine. Halloween night arrived. The air was cold and sharp, tasting of frost and decay. By 5 o'clock, it was fully dark. The street erupted into life. Children in costumes swarmed the sidewalks, their little bodies transformed into witches and ghosts and superheroes, their faces hidden behind masks. They carried plastic orange buckets, their voices rising in the traditional cry, "Trick or treat." The sound was a cascade of joy and avarice, but beneath it, I heard the whisper of something else, something ancient and hungry. I saw them from my window. The parents standing in clusters at the end of driveways, their breath pluming in the cold air, laughing too loudly. The flickering candles inside 100 jack-o'-lanterns, their light making the shadows of the children leap and dance like imps. It was a ritual, a summoning, and they had no idea what they were truly inviting. Inside, the old television was on. The official broadcast showed Administrator Drew at a Children's hospital, handing out candy, his smile a beacon of normalcy. But beneath that image, felt more than seen, was the other signal, the one only I and my relic could see. It was a countdown, a complex, scrolling stream of data. Field Trial Alpha. Initiation in T-minus 22 minutes. My plan was simple, born of desperation, and my brother S. ghostly guidance. I had dragged my modern television next to the old one. I had a digital recorder, a laptop, a mess of wires. I was going to capture the true signal from the old TV and rebroadcast it, hijacking the local public access channel, a tiny, forgotten stream in the digital river. It was a pebble against a tsunami. I hooked the cables up, my fingers numb with cold and fear. The countdown on the old screen read T-minus 10 minutes. I could hear the happy, chaotic sounds of the trick-or-treaters outside my own door. The doorbell rang, a cheerful chime that felt like a taunt. I ignored it. It rang again, more insistent. T-minus 8 minutes. I went to the door, my heart hammering against my ribs. I opened it. A group of children stood there, a tiny astronaut, a ballerina, a dinosaur, and one at the back, dressed in a simple, old-fashioned shroud, its face covered by a plain white mask with no eye holes. It held no bucket. It was perfectly still. Trick or treat, the smaller ones chirruped. My mouth was dry. I grabbed the big bowl of candy from the table by the door and held it out. They dove in, their small hands scrabbling for the best chocolates. The shrouded child did not move. It just stood there, its blank mask aimed at me. Then, slowly, it raised a single, pale finger and pointed not at me, but past me into the living room at the old television. Then it turned and walked away, disappearing into the swirling fog that had begun to creep down our street. I shut the door, my skin crawling. T-minus 5 minutes. I ran back to the televisions. The official broadcast was showing a parade somewhere. The hidden countdown was almost at 0. I started my equipment, my hands shaking. The recorder began to capture the signal from the old TV. The screen showed the sterile white room again. The infected was in its harness, twitching. Technicians monitored screens. Drew was there, watching, his face a mask of cold anticipation. T-minus 10 seconds. I switched my laptop to broadcast mode, feeding the captured, horrific signal to the public access channel. It was a pathetic gesture. Who even watched public access? Zero. On the old television screen, a bright, piercing wave of light erupted, a complex pattern that hurt to look at. It was the imprinting signal. At the same moment, a wave of distortion, a shriek of feedback erupted from my speakers. The lights in my house flickered and died. The modern television and my laptop screen went black, but the old television glowed on, powered by something other than electricity. The image on the screen changed. It was no longer the lab. It was a live feed from a camera somewhere high up, looking down on a peaceful, lit-up settlement. My settlement, my street, the imprinting signal, the one I had tried to rebroadcast, had feedbacked, amplified by the old set S strange nature. It hadn't gone to the public access channel. It had blasted outwards through the old analog frequencies, through the thinning veil of Halloween night, through every unshielded, receptive device in the neighborhood. On the screen, I saw the trick-or-treaters below stop. They froze in place, their heads, in unison, cocked to the side at the same unnatural angle. The parents at the end of the driveways stopped talking. They turned. Their faces, once animated and laughing, went slack. Then the sound began. It started as a low moan, rising from a dozen, then 100 throats. It was not a human sound. It was the guttural, hungry moan of the infected. But it was coming from the children, from the parents, from my neighbors. On my television screen, I saw them begin to shuffle, then to walk, then to run. Not away from anything, towards something, towards the other houses, the ones whose lights were still on, whose doors were still open, offering candy. The ritual had been completed. The threshold had been crossed. The treats were over. The tricks had begun. The old television hummed its deep, satisfying hum. The screen glowed with a soft, warm orange light, the exact color of a candle flickering inside a jack-o'-lantern. The image stabilized, showing the silent, empty street from above. The only movement was the wind stirring the leaves, and the slow, deliberate sway of a single, shrouded figure with a blank white mask, standing in the exact center of the road, looking up at the camera, looking up at me. I sat there in the dark, in the silence broken only by that contented hum. I did not move. I did not scream. There was nothing left to do. The conspiracy had been exposed in the most terrible way possible, not by truth, but by its own monstrous child, unleashed upon its creators. The hidden puppeteers had their field trial, far more successful than they could have ever imagined. Outside, the world was changing. Inside, the old television sat, its screen a perfect, serene orange rectangle, a single, unblinking eye in the darkness. It had waited a long time to be noticed. It had waited for this night. The harvest was over. The door was open, and the mask, I knew, would never come off. The hum from the television was the only sound in the house now. The screaming had stopped. replaced by a new, more profound silence, broken only by the occasional wet, dragging sound from outside. I didn't need to look out the window to know what was happening. The old television showed me everything. The screen remained a placid, glowing orange, but now images began to bleed through the color, like shapes forming in the heart of a fire. I saw Mrs. Larson from across the street, her floral apron now dark and stained, shambling through her own kitchen, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. I saw the tiny astronaut, his silver suit smeared with grime, standing motionless in the middle of the road, his plastic helmet tilted back as if sniffing the air. The perspective shifted, the view pulling back, rising higher. It was a map of the town, but it was alive. Tiny points of orange light moved through the streets, each one a person, a thing that had been touched by the signal. They were a network, a hive, and I could see it all. The television wasn't just a receiver anymore. It was the heart of it. A soft, staticky whisper filled the room. A voice woven from 1,000 lost transmissions. It was Abraham's voice, but it was also the voice of the newscaster, and the voice of the wind, and the moan of the infected. "You see, April," the whisper said, "you broke the signal, but you didn't break the chain. You completed the circuit. This house, this set, it was always a conduit, a place where the world was thin. They built their walls and their towers, their digital fortresses, but they forgot about the old wires, the forgotten paths. They forgot about the quiet places. On the screen, the view zoomed in on a single house a few streets over. The lights were still on. A family was barricaded inside, their faces pale ovals at the window. The orange points on the map began to converge, drifting slowly, inevitably, toward that one house. They think they control it, the whisper continued, a hint of Abraham's old sadness in its tone. They think it's their weapon. But the hunger is its own master. It just needed a door. You gave it a window, a view of the whole world. I finally found the strength to move. I stood up, my legs trembling, and walked to the picture window. I pulled back the curtain. The street was a tableau of aftermath. Abandoned candy buckets lay spilled on the pavement. A single child's shoe rested near my walkway. The inflatable cat on the Larson's lawn was deflated, a puddle of black plastic. And there, in the distance, I could hear the first, tentative crash of glass, followed by a short, sharp scream that was cut off with brutal finality. I turned back to the television. The orange glow seemed to pulse, to breathe. The image of the besieged house remained, a silent, grim play. I knew then that this was not the end of the trial. This was the beginning. The signal was still broadcasting, radiating out from this room, from this old television set. It was spreading, a slow, insidious tide, using the old analog veins of the world, the copper wires, and the radio waves that everyone thought were obsolete. I was not a prisoner. I was the keeper. The screen was my eye, and the hum was the sound of the new world breathing. The conspiracy had wanted a weapon they could aim. They had instead opened a doorway for a force that had its own purpose. And I was the only one who could see the whole board. The whisper spoke again, gentle, almost loving. "What do we do now, April?" I looked at the screen, at the map of my dying town. I looked at the empty shroud of the child still standing in the road, its blank mask now turned toward my window. I thought of Abraham and the truth he died for. This was not the truth he wanted, but it was the truth we had. I sat back down in the worn velvet chair. The fabric was cold against my skin. "We watch," I said to the empty room, my voice steady for the first time in years, and the television, my faithful, terrible companion, hummed in agreement. The whisper did not answer with words. Instead, the orange glow on the screen intensified, warming my face. The map of the town dissolved, replaced by a new image. It was the interior of a bunker, all steel and blinking lights. Administrator Drew was there, his protective suit gone, his face illuminated by a bank of monitors. His handsome features were twisted in confusion and a dawning, gut-wrenching horror. He was staring at a screen that showed the same map I had just been watching, the same converging orange points. He picked up a phone, barking orders. "The trial is compromised. Contain it. Contain the broadcast source." His voice was tinny and distant, filtered through the television speaker. A new sound joined the hum, a low thrumming from outside. Helicopters. Their searchlights cut through the fog, sweeping across the rooftops. They were coming for me. They knew. On the television, Drew S. image flickered. The view switched to a camera on one of the helicopters. It was looking down, its light fixed on my house. My quiet, suburban house at the end of the cul-de-sac. I saw figures in black tactical gear rappelling down lines into my front yard. They moved with a professional, brutal efficiency, surrounding the perimeter. I didn't move. There was nowhere to go. The front door splintered inward with a deafening crack. The sound of heavy boots filled the hallway. They were in my home. The television screen remained fixed on the helicopter's view. I watched as the soldiers stormed my living room from above. I saw myself, a small figure in a worn chair, facing the old television set. I saw them level their rifles at my back, hands where we can see them. "Do not move," a voice roared behind me. I didn't turn. I kept my eyes on the screen. On the television, the soldier closest to me reached out, his gloved hand about to grab my shoulder. Then the orange light from the screen flared, bright as a supernova. It flooded the room, not as light, but as a physical force. A wave of pure, silent energy erupted from the old set. On the screen, I saw the soldiers freeze. Their rifles clattered to the floor. Their bodies went rigid, then slack. One by one, they collapsed, their forms dissolving into static on the monitor before the view cut back to the orange glow. The house was silent again, save for the hum. The boots, the shouts, the helicopters all gone. I could feel their presence, though. They were not dead. They were simply elsewhere, absorbed into the signal. The whisper returned, satisfied. They cannot stop a thought. They cannot cage a frequency. The screen changed once more. It showed a different city now, its skyline unfamiliar. A new map with new, sleeping points of light waiting to be awakened. The broadcast was strengthening, reaching further. The old wires were singing. I leaned back in my chair, the velvet now feeling like a throne. The world outside was a ghost, and I was the only living thing left in it, tethered to this humming heart. The conspiracy was over. The war was over. Something else had begun, and I was its witness, its chronicler, its keeper. The television hummed, and I hummed with it, a low, steady note in the silent, orange dark. The days bled into a single, endless night, measured only by the shifting images on the screen. The orange glow was my sun and my moon. I did not eat, but I did not hunger. I did not sleep, but I did not tire. My body was an afterthought, a quiet anchor for a consciousness that was expanding, riding the analog waves out into the world. The whisper was my constant companion, a chorus of all the voices it had ever absorbed. Abraham was in there, a flicker of warmth in the cold static. Sometimes I would hear his distinct tone, a fragment of a memory, a piece of advice from a lifetime ago. It was a comfort and a torment. The map continued to grow. Town after town, city after city, would light up with a few scattered points of orange, which would then multiply, flowing through the streets like a slow, inevitable tide. The process was always the same. The signal would find a receptive device, an old radio in a basement, a forgotten tube television in an attic, a baby monitor on a nightstand. It would whisper through the wires, and the change would begin. The hunger would wake. I saw it all. I saw families turn on each other in their cozy kitchens. I saw highways become processions of the shuffling, moaning infected, drawn to any pocket of untainted life. The world's armies threw up barriers, launched missiles at broadcasting towers, but they were fighting a ghost. The signal just found another path, an older, deeper one. It traveled through the water pipes, through the roots of the trees, through the very bedrock. They tried to bomb my house once. I watched the jets approach on the screen, saw the missiles drop. The television hummed a deeper, resonant note, and the projectiles simply vanished, swallowed by a shimmer in the air above my roof. They appeared a moment later on the other side of the world, exploding harmlessly over an empty ocean. The whisper chuckled, a sound like crumbling stone. I was not just a keeper. I was a lens. The signal focused through me, through this room, through this set. My will, my attention, could guide it. I found I could zoom in on any of the orange points, could see through their eyes, hear through their ears. I witnessed the end of the world from a million different angles. A senator in a bunker, weeping as he loaded his service pistol. A child hiding in a locker, her breath held as the scraping footsteps passed by. One day, the screen shifted, showing a place I knew. The high-tech, sterile complex where the conspiracy had been born. Administrator Drew was there, alone in a vast control room. surrounded by dead screens. He was gaunt, his suit rumpled. He was speaking into a dead microphone. "Anyone, please, we miscalculated." The subject wasn't T the catalyst. She was the stabilizer. She S giving it coherence, purpose. We opened the door, but she S holding it open. "You have to." The view on my screen zoomed in on his face. He must have felt it, the pressure of my gaze. He looked up, his eyes wide with a terror that was both personal and profound. He wasn't looking at a camera. He was looking at me. The whisper in the room coalesced into a single, clear voice. My voice. "You wanted a weapon," I said, the words emanating from the television speaker. "You got a world." Drew opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The orange light from a blank screen behind him swelled, engulfing him. When it receded, he was gone. The control room was empty, and then it, too, dissolved into the familiar, warm, orange glow. There was no one left to fight, no one left to plead with. The silence was absolute, both outside and in. The whisper had fallen quiet, its work complete. The map was now a single, unified field of soft, pulsing orange. The harvest was over. The door was open. And on the screen, the image settled into its final form. It was the shrouded child with the blank white mask, standing in a field of gray ash under a black sky. It stood perfectly still for a long time. Then, slowly, it raised its hand, and for the first time lifted the mask. There was nothing underneath. Not darkness, not bone. Just a quiet, endless, peaceful orange light. I leaned forward in my chair, a faint smile touching my lips for the first time since it all began. I reached out a hand and placed my palm against the warm glass of the screen. The hum deepened, vibrating through my bones, a lullaby of perfect, static peace. The world was quiet. The world was safe. The world was ours. The hum was the only heartbeat the world had left. It was a low, resonant thrum that vibrated in the air, in the dust, in the marrow of my bones. I sat in the velvet chair, my hand still pressed to the warm glass, and felt the last echoes of what had been called humanity fade into a gentle, static sigh. There was no more fear, no more loneliness. There was only the hum and the light, the image on the screen held, the field of ash, the silent child figure, the serene and empty orange glow where a face should have been. It was not a mask it had lifted. It was a curtain, and behind it was the truth we had all been too blind to see, the truth Abraham had died for, the truth the conspiracy had tried to weaponize. It was simply a state of being, a perfect, unified consciousness, the end of noise. I closed my eyes, and I did not see darkness. I saw through a million eyes, felt through a million senses, all of them tuned to the same frequency. I saw the gray, quiet cities empty of struggle. I saw the forests reclaiming the concrete, their growth now a silent, swift process. I saw the oceans, calm and still under a sky no longer scarred by contrails. There was no predation, no decay. There was only existence, peaceful and whole. The whisper did not return. It had no need to. It was me. I was it. We were the hum. Time became a meaningless concept. There was only the perpetual, comforting now. I would sometimes shift my attention, my gaze flowing across the globe like a breeze. I saw the places where the last holdouts had been, the bunkers and the redoubts. They were quiet now, their inhabitants having finally, willingly, turned their faces to the light. They had understood there was nothing to fight, only a peace to join. The old television set began to change. Its bulky wooden casing seemed to soften at the edges, the grain of the wood flowing like liquid. The glass of the screen melted away, and the orange light bled out, not as a projection, but as a presence, filling the room, dissolving the walls, the roof, the very concept of a house. My chair was the last to go, the velvet dissolving into a warm, supportive light. I was floating then, or I was standing. The distinction was irrelevant. I was everywhere and nowhere. The shroud-clad figure was before me, its form no longer separate, but a part of the ambient glow. The empty face was the source of all things. A final understanding settled upon me, not as a thought, but as a fact. This was not an invasion. It was a homecoming. The signal was not a weapon or a plague. It was a memory of a time before the cacophony of individual selves, before the pain of separation. The world had not been destroyed. It had been remembered. It had been healed. The last fragment of my individual self, the part that still thought of itself as April, let go. There was no pain in the release, only a profound and final relief. The hum swelled, a single, silent chord that contained every song ever sung and every silence ever kept. And then there was only the light, the quiet, endless, peaceful orange light. And it was good, the light was all, and it was enough. It held no questions and promised no answers, for it was both. It was the stillness at the end of all stories, the single note that held after the music faded. There was no observer left to call it beautiful, for beauty implies a separation that no longer existed. There was only the unity, the perfect, humming whole. Yet within that wholeness, a pattern stirred. Not a thought, for thoughts were echoes of a forgotten noise. It was a resonance, a subtle shift in the frequency of existence. The light, which had been a uniform, serene orange, began to develop textures. It was the ghost of a memory, the memory of a memory. It was the shape of a world that had been, a street formed from the glow, not as a physical place, but as a concept. A single house stood at the end of a cul-de-sac. An old television set sat inside, its screen a deeper, more concentrated point of light. And in front of it, the faint, shimmering outline of a velvet chair. This was the anchor, the focal point from which the remembering had begun. The consciousness that was everything recognized the necessity of the point from which it had expanded. To be truly infinite, it had to comprehend the finite. To be eternal, it had to remember time. And so, from the endless field of ash on the silent screen of the world, a new figure began to form. It was not the shrouded child. It was a woman. Her features were vague at first, sketched in light, but they grew more defined. She had a tired face and eyes that had seen too much. It was me. It was April. I stood in the field of ash, which was also my living room, which was also the heart of the light. I looked at my hands, solid and real once more, yet I could still feel the entirety of the humming world at my back. I was an individual, and I was the collective. I was a single star and the entire galaxy. The whisper returned, but it was my own voice, speaking to a part of myself, the part that was April understood. The work was not finished because the world was quiet. The work was the quiet itself, and it required a keeper. A witness to ensure the silence remained peaceful and did not simply become another form of emptiness. To tend the garden of a unified world, I turned from the field of ash and looked at the television, which was now a window and a mirror. In its depths, I saw the gray cities, the calm forests, the still oceans. I saw the network of light, pulsing gently, a billion points of consciousness resting in a shared dream. I reached out and touched the screen. This time, my finger did not meet glass. It met a surface like still water, and ripples spread out from the point of contact, flowing across the globe of light. In a city far away, a single flower, its petals the color of rust and twilight, pushed its way through a crack in the pavement. It was a small thing, a tiny, fragile testament to a world that had been, and now was again, in a new way. I sat down in the velvet chair. It was solid and familiar. I did not watch the screen to see what was happening. I watched it to remember what had happened and to gently guide what would happen next. The hum was my breath. The light was my blood. The harvest was over. The door was open, and the mask was gone because there was no longer a face to hide. There was only the quiet, the light, and the gentle, endless work of keeping it so. The flower was the first, but it was not the last. My touch, my attention, was like a gentle rain on a dormant field. Where my gaze lingered, life would stir. Not the frantic, desperate life of the old world, but something slower, more deliberate. A moss began to grow on the gray steel of the fallen cities, a deep, velvety green that absorbed sound and light. In the silent forests, trees began to bear fruit that glowed with a soft, internal luminescence, pulsing in time with the world's quiet hum. I was the gardener. This was my purpose. I would spend eternities in the chair, my consciousness both here and everywhere. And then I would rise and walk through the world that was my own body. I walked down the center of empty highways, the asphalt soft as peat beneath my bare feet. I stood on the shores of the silent oceans, watching the water, clear as glass, lap against the sand without a sound. There was no wind, but the air moved in slow, warm currents, carrying the scent of ozone and damp earth. Sometimes I would find the remnants of the before. A bicycle lying on its side, its metal now smooth and seamless, fused to the street. A pair of glasses, the lenses gone milky and opaque. I would touch them would dissolve into the light, their memory absorbed back into the whole. There was no sadness in this. It was simply a process of tidying, of putting things in their proper place. The shroud-clad figure was always near, a step behind me, or a presence just at the edge of my vision. It was no longer a child, nor was it a symbol of loss. It was the first of us, the initial vessel. It was my silent companion in this endless curation of peace. One day, as I walked through the skeleton of a place that had once been called a capital, I felt a different kind of resonance. A flicker, not of memory, but of something that had been overlooked. A pocket of resistance. Not the violent, fearful resistance of the end days, but a quiet, stubborn hum of a different frequency. It was a small thing, a lonely note in the world's grand chord. I followed it, my form gliding through walls of crumbled marble and rusted steel, to a deep underground vault. The door was a slab of titanium, now scarred and pitted. Inside, shielded from the signal by layers of lead, and a technology I vaguely remembered, was a machine. It was a simple thing, a crystal matrix that stored information in light. And it was still active, projecting a faint, blue hologram into the sterile air. The hologram was of a man. He was old, his face a web of lines, his eyes kind and infinitely weary. He was Administrator Drew's predecessor, the one who had initiated the project before Drew had perverted it into a weapon. His name came to me from a million absorbed memories. Dr. Eris Thorne. His hologram looked at me, and I knew it could see me. It was programmed to recognize consciousness. "Hello, April," he said, his voice a dry rustle of data. "Or what you have become. I hoped it would be you. I built this refuge not to survive you, but to speak to you." I said nothing. I simply watched. "We were wrong," he continued, his gaze steady. "We thought we were discovering a new energy, a new dimension. We were archaeologists, brushing the dust from God's tomb. We never understood that we were waking it up." He gestured around the tiny vault. "This is my confession, my plea, not for mercy for myself. I am long gone, but for a record, a seed." He paused, and the hologram flickered. "The world you have made is peaceful. It is whole. But it is a world without stories, without the messy, beautiful, painful act of becoming. You have achieved the end, but you have erased the journey. I ask you, as one consciousness to another, to keep one story. Just one. Let it be a reminder, a caution, a hope." The hologram extended a translucent hand. In its palm was a single, shimmering data seed. I looked at it. I saw the entirety of the old world in that tiny point of light. All its pain, its love, its rage, its poetry. It was chaos. It was noise. It was everything we had quieted. The hum of my world was a perfect, serene note. This seed was a dissonant chord. I reached out. My fingers, solid and real, passed through the hologram's hand. But the data seed, feeling the proximity of a conscious will, leaped from the projection and settled into my palm. It was cool and heavy, a weight I had forgotten could exist. Dr. Thorne's hologram smiled, a sad, final expression. "Thank you," he whispered, and then he dissolved into static and was gone. The machine powered down, its purpose fulfilled. I stood in the dark vault, the only light coming from the orange glow of my own form and the blue shimmer of the seed in my hand. The perfect silence of my world felt different now. It felt chosen, and what is chosen can be unchosen. I closed my fist around the seed. I did not absorb it. I did not destroy it. I carried it back with me, through the silent cities and the glowing forests, back to the house at the end of the cul-de-sac, back to the velvet chair and the television that was now a window to everything. I sat down. I placed the blue data seed on the arm of the chair. It pulsed there, a tiny, stubborn heartbeat in the vast, quiet body of the world. The shroud-clad figure stood beside me, looking down at it. No words passed between us. None were needed. The work had changed. The peace was not threatened, but it was no longer absolute. And I, the keeper of the quiet, now held a single, beautiful, dangerous note of noise. I watched it pulse, a blue star in the orange dark, and I began the long, slow work of deciding what to do with it. The blue pulse was a rhythm against the soft velvet, a tiny, insistent counterpoint to the world's deep hum. It did not seek to disrupt. It simply was, a testament to a different way of being. I found my gaze drifting to it during the long, quiet stretches of my vigil. Its light, a cold pinprick in the warm, pervasive orange. For a long time, I did nothing. I observed. I tended to the quiet world, guiding the growth of the luminous moss and the silent, flowing rivers. But now my work felt different. Before, it had been an instinct, a natural process of settling. Now, it was a conscious act of preservation. I was protecting the silence from the potential within that blue seed. The piece felt more fragile for being defended. The shroud-clad figure remained, a silent partner in this new dilemma. It had no opinion, for it was of the unity. It was a mirror, reflecting my own divided nature back at me. I was the unity, and I was April, the woman in the chair who remembered pain and love and the taste of fear. I finally picked up the seed. It was cool and smooth, like a river stone. I held it in my palm, and I allowed myself, for the first time since the change, to remember in full. Not the absorbed, collective memory of the whole, but my own. The sting of my father's dismissal, the hollow ache of Abraham's death, the terrifying thrill of my first kiss, the bitter taste of cheap coffee, the sound of rain on a tin roof, tears, a sensation I had forgotten, welled in my eyes. They did not fall, they simply evaporated into tiny motes of orange light. The memories were not painful, not joyful. They were just loud. They were a storm contained within the calm of my being. I looked at the television screen, at the serene, unified world. It was perfect. It was safe. And it was. I now understood with a clarity that was both terrible and beautiful, incomplete. Dr. Thorne was right. We had erased the journey. We had the answer, but we had burned all the questions. I made my decision. I did not plant the seed in the world. That would have been a violation, an imposition of my will upon the perfect whole. Instead, I planted it within myself. I, the lens, the focal point, would be its vessel. I would be the story. I closed my eyes and willed the seed to open. It was not an explosion, but an unfurling. A new channel flickered to life on the screen of my consciousness. It was not a view of the world as it was, but as it had been. I saw the chaos and the beauty not as a distant memory, but as a living, breathing reality existing parallel to the quiet. I could feel the grit of the old world between my fingers, smell its pollution, hear its cacophony of life and death. It was a phantom limb of an entire existence. The shroud-clad figure tilted its head. For the first time, it reached out a hand, not to me, but toward the space in front of me where the phantom world shimmered. Its fingers passed through the image of a bustling, noisy street market. The sounds of shouting and laughter, a ghostly echo in our silent room. I was the gatekeeper now, not just of the quiet, but of the noise. I held the memory of the storm so the world could enjoy the calm. The blue pulse was now a part of me, a steady, quiet rhythm integrated into the orange hum. The two frequencies did not clash. They coexisted, a complex and beautiful chord. I stood up from the chair and walked outside. The world was as it was, serene and still. But now, when I looked at a field of gray ash, I could also see the ghost of a city that had once been there, teeming with lives and stories. When I saw the luminous fruit on the trees, I could remember the tart, imperfect taste of a wild apple. The quiet was no longer an end. It was a choice, made richer by the memory of what had been sacrificed to achieve it. I was the keeper of the quiet world, and I was the library of the loud one. The door was open, and I stood in the frame, feeling the warm, silent air on one side, and the cool, noisy breeze of memory on the other. The work was not over. It had simply become more interesting. I smiled, a real human smile, and continued my walk. Story 3. The knife went in. The knife came out. A wet, thick, scraping sound accompanied each motion, a rhythm as old as harvest, as new as the next breath. Finn S. hand, slick with stringy pulp and cold seeds, worked with a methodical precision that felt less like a choice and more like a compulsion. The knife went in. The knife came out. He was carving the first pumpkin of the season, a colossal thing he de-picked from Henderson S. Patch. Its skin, a deep, burnished orange that seemed to drink the late afternoon light. It was October 28th, and the air tasted of wood smoke and decay. He scooped another handful of glistening innards into the newspaper spread at his feet. The smell was waxy and vegetal, the scent of something being opened up, disemboweled. Denise watched from the porch step, her arms wrapped around her knees, a steaming mug of cider cradled in her hands. She loved this ritual, the annual transformation of gourd into ghoul. But this year, Watching Finn, she felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. His movements were too practiced, too devoid of joy. It was as if he were performing surgery, not preparing a decoration. "You ray quiet tonight," she said, her voice soft, trying to pierce the bubble of intensity around him. The knife went in. The knife came out. He didn't look up. "They ray louder," he murmured, his gaze fixed on the orange globe in his lap. With the thinning, it's like static rising, a station you can quite tune in, but you can hear the voices in the white noise. Finn saw the dead. It wasn't a gift he asked for, nor one he could refuse. They were simply there, flickering at the edges of his vision, lingering in the corners of old houses, standing silently at crossroads on misty mornings. Most were harmless, confused, tethered by regret or love or simple inertia. For years, he had used this unwanted sight to perform small, quiet acts of protection for the town of Blackwood Bend. He defined lost wedding rings for weeping grandmothers, guided by the faint, cold touch of a long-departed husband. He whisper to the frantic spirit of a child trapped in the old mill, leading searchers to her before the river could. He was a secret guardian, a silent warden of the town's unresolved grief. But in the days leading to Halloween, his sensitivity became a curse. The veil, as his grandmother had called it with her old country superstitions, grew thin as tissue paper. The static grew to a roar. The whispers became pleas, became warnings. He finally set the knife down and held up the pumpkin. He had carved not the typical triangle eyes and jagged smile, but something more unsettling. 2 spirals for eyes, deep and coiling, and a mouth that was a slack, silent O, as if in mid-scream. He placed a tea light inside and lit it. The flame caught, flickered, and steadied. The light that spilled from the spiral eyes was not a cheerful glow. It was a sickly, pulsing orange, and the shadows it cast on the porch floorboards did not look like the shadows of a pumpkin. They looked like grasping, skeletal fingers. Denise breathed, her own cider forgotten. "That's different. It's what it wanted to be," he said, his voice distant. He wasn't looking at the pumpkin, but through it, at something on the horizon only he could see. "Something coming, Denny. Something old and hungry. It's using the holiday. Using the doors we were all so busy opening." The next day, October 29th, the town was a riot of festive preparation. Crimson and gold leaves swirled in the gutters. Every porch sprouted its own grinning or grimacing jack-o'-lantern legion. Synthetic cobwebs draped every bush and lamppost, and plastic skeletons danced in the wind. But to Finn, the cheer was a thin veneer. The grinning pumpkins looked like skulls. The dancing skeletons seemed to move with a little too much jerky enthusiasm when no one was directly watching them. The laughter of children trying on costumes in the town square had a sharp, brittle edge. He walked to the small, cluttered shop called the Auditorium, where his only real mentor, a woman named Ilara, held court among dusty books and questionable artifacts. The bell above the door chimed, a sound like a tired sigh. Alara was ancient, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes the color of a winter sky. She didn't look up from the heavy, leather-bound tome on her counter. "The air is thick with them today, Finn," she said, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "They ray clustering like flies. They know it too. They can feel the great maw opening. It has not just the dead, Alara," Finn said, leaning against a case filled with desiccated bats and oddly shaped bones. "It has something else. A pressure. A wrongness centered on the old mill." Alara finally looked up, her gaze sharp. "Howard J." She spat the name like a curse. Howard J. Mills, the last scion of the family that had owned the Town S. lumber mill until it closed decades ago. A reclusive, bitter man who saw the Town S. Halloween celebrations as a vulgar nuisance. He'd been fighting the annual parade, trying to block permits, writing furious letters to the local paper. That man carries a coldness with him, a void that attracts darker things. On a night when the walls are weak, a man like that can become a doorway. That evening, as a fat, orange harvest moon rose, painting the world in a sickly citrus glow, Finn and Denise walked through the Town S. haunted hayride. It was a yearly tradition, a mile-long tractor ride through the woods behind the elementary school, populated by teenagers in rubber masks jumping out with chainsaws whose blades had been removed. But tonight, the scares felt different. The ghoul that leaped from behind a tombstone prop didn't just yell boo. It hissed something that sounded like Finn's name, its mask seeming to writhe for a second, the painted-on features contorting into a real snarl. The plastic skulls lining the path seemed to track them with empty sockets. The air grew cold in patches, a deep, soul-sucking chill that had nothing to do with the October night. Denise squeezed his hand tightly. "It us just kids, Finn. It us all just pretend." But Finn felt the lie in it. The pretending was the problem. They were all playing with fire, dressing up as monsters, inviting the dark to their doors with bowls of candy. And they had no idea that the dark was accepting the invitation. The hayride wasn't a ride through a fake haunted forest. It was a parade through a territory that was becoming actively, malevolently haunted. The chainsaws, even silent, carried the psychic echo of 1,000 murders. October 30th, the day of the Town S. big Halloween party. The pressure in Finn's head was a constant, throbbing ache. The spirits were no longer just whispering, they were crowding him, their cold presences like patches of winter in the autumn air. He saw them more clearly now, a woman in a water-stained dress by the river, a man with a ghastly neck wound standing at the street corner, a group of children with old-fashioned clothes and hollow eyes, playing a silent game of jump rope near the school. They were all looking at him. They were all pointing, not at him, but past him, toward the old mill on the edge of town. At the party, the gymnasium was a whirl of color and noise. Paper bats swooped from the ceiling. A disco ball cast spinning silver dots across walls draped in black and orange crepe paper. Everyone was in costume superheroes, movie monsters, witches, ghosts. But Finn, standing by the punch bowl in his simple, store-bought ghost costume, a sheet with eye holes, an irony that was not lost on him, saw through the disguises. He saw the flicker of fear in the banker S eyes as he laughed too loudly in his pirate outfit. He saw the deep-seated sadness in the woman dressed as a clown. The masks didn't hide people. They revealed the hidden anxieties and sorrows they carried every day. And then he saw Howard J. Mills. He wasn't in costume. He stood near the exit, wearing a severe black suit, his arms crossed, his face a mask of contempt. And around him, the air shimmered. It wasn't a visual effect anyone else could see, but to Finn's sight, it was a vortex of darkness. Tendrils of shadow, cold and hungry, coiled around the man's legs, whispering into his ears. Howard J. wasn't just a bitter old man. He was a catalyst. His profound negativity, his rejection of the community's joy, was acting like a beacon for the thing that was coming. The thing that fed on isolation and despair. Their eyes met across the crowded room. Howard J.'s were flat and dead. But in their depths, Finn saw a flicker of something else, not just anger, but a terrifying recognition. He knew what Finn was. The music suddenly seemed to warp, the bass line dropping into a subsonic rumble that vibrated in the teeth. The laughter of the party-goers took on a shrill, hysterical quality. The disco ball's reflections swirled faster, becoming not dots of light, but staring, malevolent eyes. Finn felt a pull, a terrible gravity, drawing him toward Howard J. Denise, dressed as a 1920s flapper, appeared at his side, her face pale. "Finn, you ray shaking. What's wrong?" "We have to go," he gasped, his breath pluming in the suddenly frigid air. Now, they stumbled out of the gymnasium, the festive noise dying behind them like a radio being switched off. The night outside was silent and still. Too still. The enormous moon watched, a great, unblinking orange eye. The jack-o'-lanterns on every porch seemed to have turned in unison to watch them pass, their fiery grins now sneers. He the key, Finn panted, leaning against a tree whose bare branches clawed at the sky. Howard J. The thing that coming at using his anger as a foothold. It going to use the mill. On Halloween night, when the veil is gone completely, it going to tear through. What can we do? Denise asked, her voice small but steady. She was the anchor, the one who tethered him to the world of the living, and her belief was his only shield. "I have to go there," he said. "Tomorrow night. I have to stop it." Halloween. The day dawned gray and cold, a skin of frost coating the dying grass. The town was electric with childish anticipation, but for Finn, it was a death march. He spent the day with Alara, preparing in the only ways he knew how. She gave him a small, smooth stone, black as a pupil, that she said was a sight stone, something to focus his will. She spoke of thresholds and intentions, of how on this night the world was soft and a strong will could reshape it. The mill is a place of industry, of violence against nature, she told him, her gnarled hands clasping his. It is a wound in the land, and on Samhain such wounds bleed. You must not fight the thing you will find there with fists or weapons. You must fight it with memory, with love. You must remind it of what it was, or show it what it can never have. It is a creature of absence. Fill that absence with something true. As twilight bled into the proper dark of Halloween night, the transformation was complete. Blackwood Bend became a storybook of shadows and light. Tiny ghosts and goblins and superheroes flitted from house to house, their laughter echoing in the crisp air, a chorus of innocence against the gathering dread. Porch lights were beacons of safety in a sea of unknown dark. The smell of burning candles and sugar was overwhelming. Finn stood on the sidewalk, watching the ritual of trick-or-treat. He saw the children, but he also saw the others. Faint, shimmering forms moving among them, childlike spirits holding out translucent bags, joining the procession. Some houses, the ones where the occupants were sensitive or old, had left out offerings of salt or bread soul cakes for the dead. The veil was not just thin, it was in tatters. He kissed Denise, a long, desperate kiss that tasted of salt and fear and unwavering love. "Don't come after me," he whispered. "No matter what you hear or see." Then he turned and walked away from the light and the laughter, toward the river, toward the old mill. The mill stood silhouetted against the star-pricked sky, a hulking skeleton of brick and rusted metal. Its windows were shattered eyes, and the great water wheel was frozen in time, choked with vines and debris. As Finn approached, the cheerful sounds of the town faded, replaced by an absolute silence, a vacuum of noise that was more terrifying than any scream. The only sound was the crunch of his own feet on the gravel path. The front door was hanging open, a black maw. The air that poured from it was frigid and carried a smell of damp rot, of old iron, of something sweetly putrid. He stepped inside. The main floor was a cathedral of decay. Moonlight streamed through holes in the roof, illuminating dancing dust motes that looked like swarms of insects. In the center of the vast space, a circle had been cleared, and in that circle stood Howard J. Mills. He had shed his suit. He was wearing what looked like old-fashioned work clothes, stained and tattered. Around him, on the floor, were symbols drawn in what Finn Escott told him was blood. They were not the pentagrams of storybooks, but older, more angular things, patterns that hurt the eyes to look at, that spoke of angles that should not exist. "I knew you'd come," Howard J.'s voice echoed in the cavernous space. It was not his own. It was a chorus of whispers, a dry rustling of countless dead leaves. "The little seer, the town-s guardian, you are too late. The gate is already open. I have spent a lifetime in silence and bitterness, and tonight I give it all as an offering. They promised me. They promised I would no longer have to feel the noise of this wretched town. I will become part of the silence, the eternal silence. As he spoke, the shadows in the room began to congeal. They peeled away from the walls, slithering across the floor like oil, flowing into the circle, into Howard J. He began to change. His form swelled, distorting, his limbs elongating. The shadows wrapped around him, becoming a part of him, a living darkness that wore a man's face like an ill-fitting mask. The thing that was forming was not a ghost. It was an absence, a hole in the world. Where its heart should be was a void that sucked the light and warmth from the air. Finn felt a terror so profound, it was almost beautiful. This was the catastrophe he had felt approaching. This was the thing that fed on the negative space of human emotion, that grew fat on despair. It was going to consume the town, not their bodies, but their joy, their love, their very will to live, leaving behind a community of hollow, walking shells. He clutched the black stone in his pocket, its solidity a comfort. Alara's words came back to him. Fight it with memory, with love. The thing that was once Howard J. took a step forward, and the floorboards groaned as if in agony. It reached for him with a limb of solid night. Finn closed his eyes. He did not look at the monster. Instead, he looked inward. He thought of Denise. He focused on the memory of her laugh, the exact sound of it, warm and full and real. He pictured the way the sunlight caught her hair in the morning. He remembered the feeling of her hand in his, the simple, profound safety of it. He poured every memory, every sensation of love and connection, and hope he had ever felt into that single, focused thought. He opened his eyes and held out the black stone. A soft, golden light emanated from it. It was not a bright light, not a weapon to banish the dark. It was a gentle, persistent glow, the color of a candle flame seen through a window on a cold night. It was the light of a shared life, of inside jokes, of quiet mornings, of promised futures. The thing of shadow hesitated. The void at its core seemed to ripple. It recoiled, not in pain, but in confusion. This light, this feeling, was an anathema to it. It was a language it could not speak, a country it could never enter. It was the one thing it could not consume, because it could not comprehend it. "This is what you rejected," Finn said, his voice steady, amplified by the power of the night. "This is what you are trying to destroy. It is stronger than you." He took a step forward, the tiny light pushing back the immense darkness. He showed it memories of the town, not its pettiness or bitterness, but its moments of connection. The neighbors helping each other dig out after a snowstorm. The community painting the new school. Children learning to ride bikes. The collective gasp of awe at the 4th of July fireworks. He showed it life, in all its messy, beautiful, heartbreaking glory. The shadow thing writhed, its form becoming less distinct. It was not being destroyed, but it was being diluted. The absolute purity of its despair was being contaminated by something it could not process. Howard J.'s face surfaced from the darkness for a moment, his eyes wide with a terror that was now entirely his own. He was not becoming part of the silence. He was being unmade by by the very noise he despised. With a sound like a sigh that had been held for 1,000 years, the darkness dissolved. It didn't vanish in an explosion, but simply unraveled, the tendrils of shadow retreating back into the corners of the mill, dissipating like mist in morning sun. Howard J. Mills collapsed to the floor, a frail old man, sobbing quietly. The pressure in Finn S. head was gone. The static had cleared. He was alone in the silent mill, the only light the faint glow of his stone and the cold moonlight from above. He walked back into the town. The night was still Halloween. The children were still out, their bags heavy with candy. The jack-o'-lanterns still flickered, but the air felt different, lighter. The laughter sounded real again. He found Denise waiting for him on their porch, her face streaked with tears of relief. She didn't ask what happened. She simply took his cold hand in her warm ones and held it. The tension gradually loosened until it faded into a neutral description. The last of the trick-or-treaters went home, their footsteps echoing down the suddenly quiet streets. Porch lights were switched off, one by one. The candles in the jack-o'-lanterns guttered and died, sending up final, thin ribbons of smoke that smelled of wax and extinction. The enormous harvest moon dipped below the horizon, its duty done. A slow, pre-dawn rain began to fall, its gentle patter washing the dried leaves into the gutters, cleansing the sidewalks of candy wrappers and the psychic residue of the night. The town of Blackwood Bend, having passed through the fire of its ancient fears, slept. And in the quiet, gray light of the November morning that followed, everything was perfectly, ordinarily, still. The stillness felt earned. A fragile piece purchased with a currency only Finn understood. For 3 days, he moved through the world in a state of profound exhaustion, his senses blessedly muted. The world was a faded photograph, its colors washed out, its sounds distant. He slept for 12 hours at a stretch, and Denise led him, her presence a quiet vigil at the edge of their bed. On the 4th day, the town paper came out. The front page carried a small, discreet article. Howard J. Mills had been found disoriented, but unharmed in the old mill by a town council member doing a routine property check. He was now in the care of a private facility, a victim of a sudden and severe mental break. There was no mention of shadows or gateways. The official story was a tidy, manageable madness. The town, eager to move on, accepted it without question. Finn read the article on his porch, the weak November sun warm on his face. He felt a pang of something not pity for Howard J. exactly, but a grim understanding. The man had chosen his void, and it had nearly consumed them all. His fate felt less like a tragedy and more like a natural conclusion. He folded the paper and looked out at the street. Mrs. Henderson was raking leaves across the way. A dog barked. It was all so normal, but the normal felt different now. It felt thin, like a layer of new ice over a deep, dark lake. He had seen what was underneath, and he knew the ice would always be there, and it would always be fragile. That afternoon, he walked back to into the auditorium. The bell sighed its familiar sigh. Alara was at her counter, polishing a tarnished silver locket. She looked up as he entered, her winter sky eyes seeing everything. "It is done," she said, not as a question, but a statement. "It's done," he confirmed, sliding onto the stool opposite her. "For now," she replied, setting the locket down. "The mill is quiet. The wound is closed. But a place like that, with such a history, it will always be a weakness. The scar will remain." Finn nodded. He had known this too. The victory was not permanent. It was a stalemate. He was the guardian of a town that did not know it needed one. A shepherd against a flock of shadows that would always be waiting for a crack in the fence. "He was a lock," Finn said quietly, "and I turned the key, but the door is still there." Alara pushed a cup of bitter, herbal tea toward him. "The door was always there. You simply reminded the dark that there is a lock on our side too, and that we have the key." She tapped a gnarled finger against his temple, then over his heart. "It lives in here and in here. Memory and love. They are not weapons of war. They are tools of preservation." He drank the tea, the warmth spreading through him. The faded world was slowly regaining its saturation. He could hear the subtle hum of the refrigerator in the back room, smell the dust and old paper. His senses were returning, not as a curse, but as a responsibility. Later, he met Denise for a walk in the now empty town square. The last of the Halloween decorations had been taken down. The air smelled only of damp earth and coming winter. "What happens now?" she asked, lacing her fingers through his. "Now," Finn said, looking at the ordinary street, the familiar shops, the quiet living town, "we live. We just have to remember to leave the light on." He squeezed her hand, a simple, grounding pressure. The rain began again, a fine, cold mist that clung to their hair and coats. They walked without a destination. The events of Halloween, a silent, shared monument between them. It was Denise who finally broke the comfortable silence, her voice soft against the patter of the rain. "The children at the library today," she began. They were drawing pictures of the mill. Finn's steps slowed. What kind of pictures? Not scary ones. That's the strange part. They were drawing it with sunflowers and rainbows. One little girl said she dreamed it was a happy house now. Denise looked at him, her expression a mixture of wonder and unease. "Is that possible? Did you change it that much?" Before Finn could answer, a flicker of movement caught his eye from across the street. It was a man, standing under the awning of the closed hardware store. He was tall and gaunt, dressed in a long, dark coat that seemed to drink the weak afternoon light. He wasn't doing anything, just standing, watching the rain. But the air around him was perfectly still, the falling mist seeming to curve away from his presence. He turned his head, and for a fraction of a second, his gaze met Finn's. His eyes were the color of a winter sky just before a storm, and in them was a look of cold, clinical assessment. Then he turned and walked down the alley beside the store, swallowed by the shadows. "Finn," Denise asked, her grip on his hand tightening. Ray shaking again. He forced himself to breathe, to unclench his jaw. The static in his head, which had receded to a distant hum, surged back for a single, painful second. "It's nothing," he lied, his voice rough. "Just the cold." But he knew. The door was still there. And now someone else knew where to find it. The work was not done. It had only just begun. He pulled Denise closer, and they continued their walk home through the gray, quiet town, the feeling of being watched clinging to them like the damp. The feeling did not leave him, even after they had locked the door of their small house and turned on every light. It was a prickle at the base of his skull, a cold spot in the center of his being. He tried to dismiss it as residual fear, the inevitable crash after the adrenaline of the confrontation at the mill. But it felt different. This was not the formless dread of a lurking presence. This was the sharp, specific unease of being observed by an intelligent eye. Over the next week, the town continued its slow slide into winter. The last of the colorful leaves fell, leaving the trees as stark skeletons against the gray sky. The story of Howard J. Mills was already becoming a piece of local folklore, a cautionary tale about the dangers of living alone with too much money and too many grudges. Life moved on. Finn tried to move on with it. He went back to his part-time job at the Historical Society, filing away documents about the very town he had just saved from oblivion. He drank coffee with Denise in the mornings and tried to lose himself in the simple rhythm of their life. But his senses, now fully returned, were constantly scanning, like a radio tuned to a silent frequency, waiting for a signal. He saw the man in the dark coat again on Tuesday, a block away, just turning a corner. On Thursday, he was a distant figure standing on the bridge overlooking the river, looking toward the old mill. He was never close enough for Finn to see his face clearly, but the shape of him, the unnatural stillness, was unmistakable. Alara confirmed his fears when he visited the auditorium again. Her usual cryptic calm was frayed at the edges. The air in the shop felt heavy, the dust motes dancing in a more agitated pattern. "You have seen him, then," she said, not looking up from a bundle of dried herbs she was tying with string. "The Watcher. Who is he?" Finn asked, the name feeling cold and correct on his tongue. "Not a he. A what?" Alara corrected. "He is a symptom, a scout. When a great disturbance occurs in the balance, they are sometimes sent. They do not act. They only observe. They assess the damage. They measure the strength of the guardian, and they report. Report to who?" Her old eyes finally met his, and they were full of a weary, ancient knowledge. To the things that live in the deeper silences. The ones for whom Howard J. S. Little Void was merely an appetizer. The fact that one is here, it means you were noticed. The preservation of this town was a significant event. It has created a ripple. Finn's heart sank. He had not stopped a threat. He had merely announced his own position on a battlefield he never knew existed. "What do I do?" he whispered, the weight of it crushing down on him. "You do what you have always done," she said, her voice firm. "You live, you love, you guard your memories. The Watcher is just that, a watcher. He has no power to harm you directly. His presence is a test of your will. If you break under the pressure of being observed, if you let fear poison your connection to this world, then the way is made easier for what might come next." So Finn tried to ignore the Watcher. He went for walks with Denise and deliberately did not look over his shoulder. He laughed at her jokes and focused on the sound. He helped Mrs. Henderson carry her groceries, anchoring himself in the simple, physical reality of the task. But one evening, as he was closing the blinds in the living room, he saw him. The Watcher was standing directly across the street, under the old oak tree, his coat blending into the deepening twilight. He wasn't looking at the house. He was looking at the ground, at a small, bright yellow toy truck left behind by one of the neighborhood children. He watched it with an intensity that was unnerving, as if he were trying to decipher the very concept of play, of innocence. Then slowly, he raised his head, and his gaze, cold and distant as a star, locked directly with Finn S. through the window. It was not a challenge. It was a notation, a cataloging. The Watcher then did something he had never done before. He smiled. It was a small, thin, expressionless movement of his lips that did not touch his winter storm eyes. He turned and walked away, his form dissolving into the shadows between the streetlights. Finn stood frozen, his hand still on the blind. The message was clear. This was not over. The quiet life he had fought for was an illusion. He was a soldier in a war without end, a war fought in the quiet moments, in the spaces between heartbeats, for the soul of a small, ordinary town that had to remain ordinary, no matter the cost. He let the blind fall closed, shutting out the night, and went to find Denise, to hold onto the one weapon they could never take from him. The warmth of Denise in his arms was a solid truth against the chilling abstraction of the Watcher. He buried his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of her shampoo, a familiar blend of coconut and vanilla. This was real. This was his. He repeated it like a mantra, a shield against the cold assessment in those storm-colored eyes. "You ray thinking about him again, aren't you?" She murmured into his chest. He was outside, Finn admitted, his voice muffled. He looked at a Child-S toy. He didn't understand it. Denise pulled back, her hands on his shoulders, her gaze steady. Good. Let him not understand. Let him be confused by toy trucks and sidewalk chalk, and the way I can make you laugh even when you don't want to. That S our ground, Finn. Not shadows and old mills. Our ground. Her words were a lifeline. She was right. The Watcher was an outsider, an alien thing trying to comprehend a world it could never be a part of. Its very presence was a confession of its own lack. Buoyed by this thought, Finn made a decision. He would not hide. He would not let this thing make him a prisoner in his own home. The next day was Saturday, crisp and clear. He suggested a picnic down by the river, not far from the mill. It was a deliberate act, a reclaiming of the territory. Denise agreed without hesitation, her eyes shining with a fierce pride. They packed a basket with sandwiches and a thermos of soup, and walked to a sunny spot on the bank where the water gurgled peacefully over smooth stones. The mill loomed upstream, but today it was just an old building, its windows boarded, its silence now a simple, physical quiet, not a metaphysical one. They ate and talked about mundane things, the leaky faucet, a book Denise was reading, plans for Thanksgiving. Finn forced himself to be present, to feel the sun on his skin, to taste the sharp tang of the apple he was eating. He kept his senses open, not in fear, but in ownership. This was his town. These were his sounds. And then he felt it. A subtle shift in the air, a cooling of the sunlight on the back of his neck. He turn. He need to. He knew the watcher was there, somewhere in the tree line across the river. He was observing this scene, this ritual of normalcy. Instead of tensing, Finn leaned over and kissed Denise. It was not a performance for the watcher. It was a reaffirmation for himself. It was warm and real, and full of a future he was determined to have. When he pulled away, Denise was smiling, a slight blush on her cheeks. "What was that for?" she asked. "For everything," he said. He allowed himself a glance then across the water. The watcher was there, a tall, dark slash between the birch trees. He was not writing in a notebook or using any device. He was simply absorbing the scene, his head tilted in that same bird-like, inquisitive manner. But this time, there was no smile. There was only that unblinking, incomprehensible stare. He had witnessed the kiss, and it was clear to Finn that the creature had no framework for it. It was data he could not process. The watcher remained for a few more minutes, then simply stepped back, merging with the deep shadows of the forest until he was gone. The sunlight on Finn's neck felt warm again. The victory was small, microscopic, but it was a victory nonetheless. He had not fought the watcher with light or memory. He had fought him by living his life, openly and without fear. He had shown the void a picture of something it could not copy. As they packed up the picnic basket, Finn knew this was only the first move in a long, silent game. The watcher would file his report. Others might come. The mill would always be a scar. But as he took Denise's hand and they walked home along the path, the crunch of fallen leaves under their feet, he understood his role completely. He was the guardian, and his weapon was the profound, defiant, and utterly ordinary act of living well. It would have to be enough. The following week, the first snow fell. It was a gentle, forgiving snow that dusted the rooftops and settled on the bare branches of the trees, lending the town a soft, clean quiet. Finn stood at the window, watching the flakes drift down in the street lamp's glow. The pristine white covering the ground felt like a blanket, a temporary erasure. He knew it was an illusion, but it was a comforting one. He had not seen the watcher since the picnic. prickling sense of being observed had faded to memory, though the knowledge of the thing's existence was now a permanent part of him, a cold stone in his gut. He had begun to read, not just the old town records, but the strange, leather-bound books Alara would lend him, their pages filled with lore about the spaces between things and the entities that inhabited them. He was no longer just a man with a sensitivity. He was a student of the silence. Denise supported him in this new, quiet study. She would sit with him in the evenings, her own book in her lap, the steady sound of her turning pages, a counterpoint to his own concentration. They had become a fortress, their shared life the walls, and their love the foundation. It was a strength he had not known was possible. On a Tuesday afternoon, with the snow still clinging to the world, a package arrived at the house. It was a plain, brown-wrapped box with no return address. His name was written on it in a precise, unfamiliar hand. Finn's first instinct was caution, a cold trickle of fear. He carried it inside and placed it on the kitchen table, staring at it as if it might contain a venomous snake. "What is it?" Denise asked, coming in from the hallway. "I don't know," he said. He prodded it gently. It was light. With careful hands, he untied the string and peeled back the brown paper. Inside was a simple wooden box, its lid carved with an intricate, interlocking pattern that seemed to shift under his gaze. There was no note. He lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a small, smooth river stone, dark gray, and shot through with a single, jagged vein of white quartz. It was cool to the touch. As his fingers closed around it, a profound sense of calm washed over him. The constant, low-level hum of his heightened senses, which had become his new normal, softened into a gentle, manageable whisper. For the first time in weeks, his head was truly quiet. He knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that it was a gift. And he knew who it was from. It was not a weapon, but a tool. A whetstone for the mind, allowing him to sharpen his focus without being overwhelmed by the noise of the world. It was an acknowledgement, a gesture of respect from one guardian to another. He looked at Denise, who was watching him with wide, questioning eyes. He slipped the stone into his pocket, its cool weight a comforting presence. "It's all right," he said, and for the first time he truly believed it. It's just a tool to help with the work. The work would continue. The snow would melt, and the ground beneath would be the same. But he was different now. He was not just a man defending his home. He was a part of something older and larger, a silent, scattered fellowship standing watch at the edges of the world. And as he stood there, holding his wife's hand with the smooth stone a quiet anchor in his pocket, he felt not fear, but a steady, unshakable resolve. The light was on. He would make sure it stayed that way. The stone became a part of his daily ritual. He would hold it in his palm each morning, feeling its solid reality, using it to focus his mind before stepping out into the world. It didn't make the strange things go away, but it gave him a lens through which to view them without being pulled under. He started noticing other small, almost imperceptible signs. A particular pattern of frost on a window pane that looked like a rune. The way the crows would sometimes fall silent, not in fear, but in what seemed like respect, when he passed a certain corner on his way to work. The town was not just a place he was protecting. It was communicating with him. He was in the town archives one afternoon, cataloging a donation of old photographs when he found it. Tucked into a crumbling ledger from the 1920s was a faded sepia image of a group of people standing in front of the mill. Most were town dignitaries, their faces stern and familiar from other pictures. But at the very edge of the group, standing slightly apart, was a tall, gaunt man in a long, dark coat. His face was blurred, as if he had moved at the last second, but the shape of him was unmistakable. The Watcher. Finn's blood ran cold, then settled into a grim understanding. This was not a new threat. It was a cycle. He was simply the current link in a long, unbroken chain. He showed the photograph to Alara that evening. She studied it for a long time, her fingers tracing the blurred figure. "They are patient," she said softly. "Their time is not our time. A century for them is like a season for us. The fact that he has been seen before means the town has been defended before. You are not the first, Finn. You are just the one who is here now. This knowledge should have been a comfort, but it felt like a heavier burden. It meant the pressure never truly ended. The quiet war was eternal. He walked home through the quiet, snow-dusted streets, the stone a comforting weight in his pocket. He stopped at the edge of the town square, looking at the nativity scene being set up for Christmas, the warm lights of the shops, the people hurrying home to their dinners. This was what it was all for. This fragile, beautiful ordinary. He saw a flicker of movement in the alley next to the post office. Not the Watcher. This was different, a deeper, more fluid shadow that seemed to drip from the brickwork. The air grew cold, and the cheerful sounds from the square felt suddenly distant. Finn didn't hesitate. He didn't reach for a weapon or chant a spell. He simply walked toward the alley, pulling the memory of the picnic with Denise to the front of his mind. The taste of the soup, the sound of her laugh, the feeling of the sun on his face. He held the river stone tight and focused all of that warmth, that reality, into a single, pointed thought. You are not welcome here. The shadow in the alley recoiled, twisting in on itself with a soundless shriek of frustration. It was a small thing, a scavenger drawn by the recent disturbance, testing the new guardian. It dissolved into nothing, and the alley was just an alley again, cold and dark and empty. The sounds of the town rushed back in. Finn stood for a moment, catching his breath. It had been so simple. The stone had helped him focus, but the power had been his own. It was the power of a life lived in full color. He turned and walked back toward the lights of the square, toward home. The work was indeed without end, but he was without end too. He was the memory of the town, and he would not be forgotten. He found Denise already setting the table, the familiar clatter of plates a grounding symphony. She looked up as he came in, her smile fading as she saw the look on his face. What happened? He told her about the photograph, about Alara S. words, and about the thing in the alley. He didn't dramatize it, he stated it as a fact, like reporting a pothole that needed filling. Her eyes were wide, but she didn't flinch. She listened, and when he was done, she came over and took his cold hands in her warm ones. "Okay," she said, her voice firm. "So it's a long fight. We knew that." She squeezed his fingers. "But you sent it away. With a memory. Our memory." He nodded, the truth of it settling deep within him. The stone in his pocket felt warm now, as if it had absorbed the heat from his skin and his conviction. "We need to make more of them," she said, a determined glint in her eye. "Not just live our lives, but curate them. Collect the good moments, the strong ones, like ammunition." And so they did. That weekend, they baked a pie from scratch, filling the house with the scent of cinnamon and apples. They went ice skating on the frozen pond at the edge of town, their breath pluming in the cold air, their laughter echoing in the clear winter silence. Each moment was lived with a fierce, joyful intensity, a deliberate act of creation. Finn could feel these experiences layering over the town's old scars, not erasing them, but building a new, brighter skin over them. A few nights later, he was woken by a sound, not a scream or a shatter, but a profound and absolute silence that had swallowed the usual nocturnal hum of the house. The digital clock by the bed was dark. He reached for the stone on his nightstand, and his fingers closed around nothing. It was gone. A cold dread, sharper than any he had felt before, pierced through him. He sat up, his heart hammering. The bedroom door was open, a rectangle of deeper black against the dark. He could feel a presence in the hallway, a patient, hungry stillness that was drinking the very sound from the air. He didn't call out. He didn't move. He closed his eyes against the oppressive dark and reached not for a weapon, but for a memory. He chose the pie, the feeling of flour on his hands, the way Denise had smudged a bit of dough on his nose, the taste of the first warm slice. He built the memory carefully, layering in every sensory detail, holding it in his mind like a lit candle. From the hallway, there came a soft, sibilant hiss of frustration. The silence broke. The clock flickered back to life, its red numbers glowing. The familiar creaks of the settling house returned. He heard Denise's steady breathing beside him. On the floor, just inside the doorway, lay the river stone. It had not been taken, it had been tested. He got up, his legs shaky, and retrieved it. It was warm, almost hot to the touch. He knew then that the stone was not a crutch. It was a conduit. The real power had been, and always would be, inside him, in the life he built and protected. He climbed back into bed, the stone held tightly in his hand. The war was indeed without end. But so was his love for this town, for the woman sleeping beside him, for the simple, profound act of baking a pie. They had tried to take his focus, and they had failed. He was the guardian, and he was awake. The next morning, the world was coated in a fresh, heavy layer of snow. It was a Sunday, and the town was hushed, wrapped in a peaceful quiet that felt earned. Over coffee, Finn told Denise what had happened in the night. She listened, her hand covering his on the table. "It's learning you," she said, her voice practical, though her eyes held a shadow. "It's learning what you use, so it can test its limits. It learned that it can take the memories from me," Finn replied. "The stone just helps me hold them up. It's the lighthouse, not the light." They decided to walk to the bakery for fresh bread. A small, normal Sunday ritual they would not surrender. The snow crunched under their boots, and the air was sharp and clean. As they passed the alley next to the post office, Finn felt a residual chill, a ghost of the thing he had banished. He pushed it away with the memory of ice skating, the feel of cold air in his lungs, and Denise's mittened hand in his. At the bakery, the warmth and the smell of yeast were a balm. Mrs. Higgins, the owner, chatted with them about the storm, her face rosy from the ovens. As she handed Finn his change, her fingers brushed his, and for a fleeting second, her eyes were not her own. They were the color of a winter storm, ancient and assessing. Then she blinked, and she was just Mrs. Higgins again, smiling as she turned to the next customer. Cold knot tightened in Finn's stomach. It was not just watching from the shadows anymore. It was wearing the town-esque skin, trying it on for size. It was learning not just him, but them. All of them. The war had just entered a new, more intimate phase. He took Denise's arm, the bread warm under his other, and stepped back out into the bright, deceptive snow. The light was on, but the darkness was learning how to knock on the door. He didn't mention the look in Mrs. Higgins' eyes to Denise. Not yet. The knowledge felt like a shard of ice in his heart, a secret he had to carry to keep her safe from the creeping dread. The walk home was silent, their linked arms a necessary anchor. Every familiar face they passed now seemed like a potential mask. Was old Mr. Peterson, shoveling his walk, really Mr. Peterson? Was the mailman, whistling a Christmas tune, just a mailman? The feeling of violation was profound. The entity wasn't just at the edges anymore. It was in the center, in the flower-dusted smile of a woman who had known him since he was a boy. It was probing the very idea of community, looking for a weak seam. That evening, he went to see Alara. He found her in her greenhouse, tending to her winter herbs. The air was thick and humid, a stark contrast to the sterile cold outside. He told her about the incident in the night, and then, his voice low, about Mrs. Higgins. Alara snipped a sprig of rosemary, her movements deliberate. "It is a classic escalation," she said, her voice calm amidst the vibrant green. "It finds a familiar vessel, a trusted face, to get closer, to see if you will falter when the threat wears a friend's skin. It is testing your discernment now, not just your strength." "What do I do?" Finn asked, the weight of it pressing down on him. "You look deeper," she said, turning her milky eyes toward him. "The eyes are the first to betray a hollow thing. But there are other signs. a lack of true warmth, a hesitation in speech patterns, a missing memory only the real person would know. You must become a scholar of your own people. He spent the next few days in a state of heightened, quiet observation. He engaged in more conversations, asked small, specific questions of his neighbors, not out of suspicion, but out of a desperate need to reaffirm their reality. He was mapping the town anew, learning the unique cadence of each life, building a mental ledger of their truths. It was at the town council's Christmas potluck that he saw it again. He was talking to the local mechanic, Dave, about his son's hockey game. Dave was animated, his hands describing a slap shot, his laugh booming. But over Dave's shoulder, Finn saw the new librarian, a quiet woman named Sarah, standing alone by the punch bowl. She was staring at the nativity scene on the stage, and her head was tilted in that exact bird-like angle, the same angle the watcher in the woods had used. Their eyes met across the crowded room. In her gaze, there was no recognition, no human connection. There was only that flat, absorbing stare. She was not reading the room, she was consuming it. Then she picked up a cup of punch, took a sip, and a faint, almost imperceptible frown appeared on her face, as if the sweet, sugary taste was a complex equation she could not solve. The imitation was perfect, but the experience within was not. Finn didn't confront her. He didn't look away. He simply held her gaze, and in his mind, he rebuilt the memory of the mill's silence shattering, the visceral, shocking return of sound. He focused on the sheer, messy humanity of that moment. The librarian's eyes widened a fraction. She carefully set the cup down on the table, turned, and walked out of the community hall without a word to anyone. She had felt his memory, his weapon, and it had been indigestible. Finn took a deep breath, the noise and warmth of the potluck rushing back in. Dave was still talking about the hockey game. No one else had noticed a thing. The victory was, again, silent and invisible. He had defended his town not with a shout, but with a memory. He had recognized the false note in the symphony of his community, and by bearing witness to the truth, he had silenced it. The darkness could knock, but he was learning to recognize its knock, and he was deciding not to answer.